Hey dreamers, tonight I want to take you somewhere ancient and sacred, where the spirits of a continent whisper their stories through the echoing canyons of history. Have you ever wondered where the deepest spiritual teachings of Native American culture originated? Who brought humanity the sacred ceremonies that would sustain entire nations for thousands of years? Tonight, we're exploring the great spirits of Native American mythology, divine beings whose influence shaped civilizations, defined relationships between humans and the natural world, and continue to resonate through indigenous communities to this day. Before we get cozy, if these little journeys help you unwind, tap that like button. A tiny gesture for you, and it helps me keep creating these daily moments of calm for you to relax to. And I'd love to know, which Native American spirit is your favorite? Share it in the comments. Mine is definitely Coyote. All right, take a deep breath. Let's begin. Long ago, in that vast stretch of time before history learned to write itself down, there existed a time of profound spiritual need among the Lakota people. The world, as they understood it, had entered a period of great darkness. Not a physical darkness, though the Black Hills cast long shadows across the sacred lands, but a spiritual one. The connection between humanity and the Creator, what they called Wakantanka, had become frayed and uncertain. The people had begun to forget the old ways. They had lost the language through which to speak to the great mystery. And in that loss, something fundamental began to crumble within their communities. Imagine, if you will, walking through these ancient times alongside two young hunters. Picture the Black Hills of what we now call South Dakota, not the tourist destination with its carved monuments, but the sacred place as it existed centuries ago. These were the hunting grounds where the great buffalo herds moved like living rivers across the grasslands. The two warriors set out on a morning when the air carried that peculiar quality of stillness that speaks of something about to change. They were hunting for food, yes, but also fulfilling their role as protectors and providers for their people. Their bows were strung tight, their eyes sharp, and their hearts carried the weight of responsibility that comes with such a calling. As they moved through the landscape, scanning the horizon for movement, something unusual caught their attention. In the distance, approaching across the rolling terrain, there appeared to be a white shape. At first, they might have mistaken it for a distant cloud, a strange object on a landscape they knew intimately. But as this shape drew nearer, moving with a purposeful grace, they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. It was a white buffalo calf. Now, white buffalo were almost impossibly rare, appearing perhaps once in thousands upon thousands of births. To see one in the flesh represented something deeply sacred, a moment that bridged the visible and invisible worlds in a way that happened rarely in a lifetime. The hunters stopped, their bodies going rigid with the knowledge that they stood in the presence of something holy. But then, something even more remarkable occurred. As the white buffalo calf moved closer, its form began to shimmer and transform. This is where the story enters the realm of the purely mystical. The animal didn't simply disappear instead. It changed, shifted, evolved into something new. Standing before them now was not an animal at all, but a beautiful young woman, dressed in garments of white buckskin that seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. She carried a sacred bundle across her back, a ceremonial object of profound significance. In this moment, the hunters found themselves in the presence of something that transcended ordinary reality, a being who belonged to the realm of spirits and sacred power. Now here's where the story takes a turn that reveals something deeply important about the spiritual laws that govern the universe according to Lakota teaching. The two hunters, being men, experienced this encounter very differently. One of them looked upon this beautiful woman and harbored lustful thoughts. He allowed his mind to stray toward desires of a carnal nature. The other hunter, however, recognized something that his companion did not, that this was a Wakan being, a sacred entity who existed on a different plane of existence. He recognized the danger and the holiness simultaneously, and he lowered his eyes in respect and prayer. This distinction between the two men would prove to be the defining difference in their fates. The woman, whose name was White Buffalo Calf Woman, perceived the thoughts of both hunters. With a gesture, she called forward the man who had been entertaining disrespectful thoughts. And here's where the cosmic logic of mythology asserts itself, a logic that is, let's say, refreshingly uncompromising in its application of cosmic justice. A great cloud descended upon this man, enveloping him completely in its dark embrace. When the cloud lifted away minutes later, all that remained was his skeleton, stripped completely of all flesh and blood, reduced to bare bone. It was as though the universe had compressed his entire remaining lifespan into those few moments, allowing him to live out all the years that would have followed in accelerated time, then die and decay before their very eyes. There's something almost eloquent about this punishment. Really, the universe essentially said, "You desired her for your own gratification? Very well, granted. And here are all the consequences of that selfish desire played out at supernatural speed." The second hunter, witnessing this transformation of his companion, understood with profound certainty what he was facing. He fell to his knees immediately, his body moving into a posture of prayer and supplication. His mind emptied of all desire, all ambition, all thoughts except for reverence and spiritual recognition. White buffalo calf woman approached this kneeling man, and her demeanor changed completely. Where there had been cosmic retribution, now there was purpose and teaching. She spoke to him, her voice carrying the weight of ages and the authority of the divine. They would not need to wait long for her, coming she would arrive in 4 days' time. He was to prepare them, to gather the elders, the leaders, and all the people into a sacred circle. They were to await her arrival, for she brought teachings that would restore what had been lost. The hunter did exactly as he was instructed. He returned to his encampment, and there he found the councils and the gatherings of his people. To them, he recounted everything that had transpired, describing the white buffalo calf, the transformation, the terrible swift judgment, and the divine message. Not everyone believed him. Of course, such is the nature of extraordinary claims. But something in his telling rang true. There was an authenticity to his fear and his reverence that couldn't be manufactured. So the people prepared themselves. They arranged themselves in a great circle, a sacred geometric form that would appear again and again throughout Native American spiritual practice. They waited with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension that must have been almost unbearable. And on the fourth day, exactly as promised, she came. The accounts describe a cloud descending from the sky, and from within that cloud, stepping forth, came the white buffalo calf once more. As the calf descended to the earth, it transformed again, this time into the magnificent woman they had been waiting for. She entered into the circle of the gathered people, and as she did, she began to sing. The song that emerged from her throat was a sacred song, a melody that was understood to carry spiritual power and the imprint of the divine. She held before her the sacred bundle, the ceremonial object that she had carried on her back throughout her journey. This bundle, the people understood, contained something of profound significance. It was the white buffalo calf pipe, an object of such sacredness that it would be preserved by the Lakota people for thousands of years to come. For 4 days, white buffalo calf woman remained among the Lakota people. Her teachings were comprehensive and profound, addressing nothing less than the fundamental spiritual structure through which humanity relates to the Creator and to all of creation. She explained the sacred bundle and its meaning. She taught the people about the ceremonial pipe itself, how it was to be held, how it was to be used, and what it symbolized. The pipe itself became a channel through which the people could communicate with the Creator, a physical representation of their connection to the divine. To hold the pipe was to participate in something sacred, something that transcended ordinary human experience. But her teachings extended far beyond simply explaining an object. She gave the Lakota people 7 sacred ceremonies, 7 rituals through which they could maintain their relationship with the Great Mystery and ensure balance and harmony in their lives and communities. The first was the Sweat Lodge ceremony, known as the Purification Ritual. This was a practice through which individuals would enter a lodge heated by stones, sweating out impurities both physical and spiritual, entering a state of deep purification and communion with the divine. The second was the naming ceremony, through which newborn children would be formally recognized and named, given their place within the community and the spiritual cosmos. The third was the healing ceremony, a ritual through which individuals who were sick or wounded in body, mind, or spirit could be restored to wholeness and balance. The fourth of the 7 sacred ceremonies was the adoption ceremony, known also as the making of relatives. This ceremony recognized that kinship extended beyond blood relations and acknowledged the spiritual bonds that could connect any human beings to one another. The fifth was the marriage ceremony, through which 2 people entered into a sacred partnership, understood not as merely a civil or romantic arrangement, but as a spiritual union blessed and witnessed by the entire community and by the divine forces themselves. The sixth ceremony was the vision quest, a ritual through which individuals, particularly young people seeking to understand their purpose and path in life, would venture into wilderness and prayer, fasting and meditating in the hope of receiving visions and guidance from the spiritual realm. And the 7th of these ceremonies was the sun dance, known also as the people's ceremony. This was perhaps the most significant of all the sacred rituals, a ceremony performed for the well-being of the entire nation, not for individuals. In the sun dance, warriors would pierce their chests, having skewers passed through the flesh, and would be suspended from a central pole, their bodies becoming instruments through which sacred power could flow for the benefit of all their people. It was an act of extraordinary sacrifice and spiritual commitment, a visible reminder that the sacred realm demanded both personal transformation and communal responsibility. White Buffalo Calf Woman sang the songs that accompanied each of these ceremonies. She taught the traditional ways, the proper methods for performing each ritual. She explained the symbolism embedded within each practice, revealing how these ceremonies created a framework through which human beings could understand their place in the cosmos and maintain harmony with all of creation. And she made something explicitly clear to the Lakota people. As long as they performed these ceremonies, as long as they maintained these sacred traditions, they would endure as a people. They would remain as the caretakers and guardians of the sacred land. Their connection to the earth itself would protect them. And more than this, she promised them that, as long as they respected the land and cared for it according to these teachings, the Lakota people would never die. They would always live. This promise was profound in its implications. In Lakota understanding, death is not always the ultimate ending that Western culture often treats it as. There exists a continuity, a cycle of life and spiritual rebirth that ensures the persistence of a people and a way of being in the world. By fulfilling their obligations to the sacred land and performing the ceremonies with sincerity and respect, the Lakota were securing not just their physical survival, but their spiritual continuation. When the 4th day reached its conclusion, White Buffalo Calf Woman prepared to depart. She gathered the sacred bundle to herself once more, though she left a copy of the sacred pipe with the people, understanding that they would need something tangible to anchor their practice and their memory. She walked away from the circle of gathered people, moving back toward the direction from which she had come. But then, as she did, she turned to look back one final time, and in that final moment of transformation, she rolled upon the earth. With each rotation, her form changed color. She rose as a black buffalo. She lay down and rose again, this time as a yellow buffalo. She rolled once more and stood as a red buffalo. And then, on the final rotation, she transformed into a white buffalo calf, the form in which she had first appeared to the hunters. This transformation through the 4 colors carried profound meaning. The 4 colors, white, yellow, red, and black, represented the 4 races of humanity as understood in Lakota cosmology. They also represented the 4 sacred directions, north, east, south, and west. They embodied the 4 seasons that turn through the year, and they symbolized the sacred path of the sun itself, the daily journey of light across the sky. In the moment after she completed this final transformation, something remarkable occurred across the plains. Great herds of buffalo, Thousands upon thousands of them suddenly appeared surrounding the encampment. These herds, which had been difficult to locate in recent times, now presented themselves in abundance. Food was suddenly plentiful. The famine that had been afflicting the people was ended. The spiritual teaching and the material blessing arrived together, each reinforcing the other. The buffalo themselves became a living reminder of White Buffalo Calf Woman's visit, a constant presence that would sustain the Lakota people physically, even as her teaching sustained them spiritually. But there was more to come in her prophecies. Before departing, White Buffalo Calf Woman made a promise of return. She told the people that within herself existed 4 ages, perhaps representing the 4 colors through which she had transformed, or perhaps representing 4 vast stretches of human time. In each of these ages, she promised, she would look back upon the people. And in the 4th age, at a time when humanity had perhaps forgotten her teachings, when the world had entered into a period of spiritual imbalance and confusion, she would return. At that time, she would come to restore harmony and balance to the world. She would work to heal the relationship between humanity and the natural world, between the spiritual realm and the material world. This prophecy carried within it a sign, a marker through which the Lakota would know that her return was approaching. That sign would be the birth of a white buffalo calf in the world. Such a birth would be extraordinary, just as her initial appearance had been. The likelihood of such an event would be almost infinitesimal, perhaps 1 in several million births. And yet, the prophecy suggested that when this event did occur, it would signal that the time of her return was drawing near. The Lakota would know to prepare themselves spiritually, to renew their commitment to the sacred teachings and ceremonies, and to await her restoration of balance. The sacred bundle that White Buffalo Calf Woman left behind, the White Buffalo Calf Pipe, has been preserved in a sacred place ever since. It is kept on the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation in South Dakota, protected and honored by a man who holds the specific ceremonial role of keeper of the White Buffalo Calf Pipe. This individual, whose name is traditionally kept within the community, serves as the custodian of this sacred object and the traditions that accompany it. The pipe remains, after all these centuries, the most sacred object of the Lakota people. It is not used in everyday contexts. It is brought out only for the most significant ceremonies, for moments of profound spiritual importance. And its very existence serves as a tangible reminder of the moment when the divine entered the world and taught humanity how to live in balance and harmony. Now, having explored the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman and understood something of how she brought order, ceremony, and spiritual structure to the Lakota people, we must turn our attention to a very different spirit entity. If White Buffalo Calf Woman represents the divine teacher, the bringer of order and sacred law, then Coyote represents something far more ambiguous and complex. Coyote is the trickster, the transformer, the being who dances on the boundary between chaos and creation, who often helps humanity even when he's trying to harm it, and who challenges the established order even as he helps to establish it. Coyote appears throughout the mythology and spiritual traditions of numerous Native American peoples. Unlike White Buffalo Calf Woman, who belongs specifically to the Lakota and related Sioux peoples, Coyote emerges across the cultures of the Plains, the California Territories, the Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest. He takes on different characteristics depending on the specific tribe whose stories he inhabits. He's a cultural hero among the Nez Perce and the tribes of the Pacific Northwest, where he performs acts that prepare the world for human habitation. He's a creator figure in the mythology of the California tribes, participating in the very formation of the cosmos itself. But across all these traditions, certain core characteristics remain consistent. Coyote is always clever, always cunning, always operating according to a logic that seems to honor both selfish impulse and communal benefit simultaneously. a contradiction that is far more interesting than simple consistency. In the mythology of the Pacific Northwest, Coyote takes on a particularly significant role in the process of world creation and preparation. According to the stories of the Nez Perce, the Palouse, the Spokane, and the Coeur d'Alene peoples, there was a time before humanity existed when the world was inhabited by animal people. Not animals in the modern sense, but beings who could take animal form and human form interchangeably, who possessed powers we would now associate with gods or spirits. In this ancient world, there existed a being known as Wishpush, a monstrous beaver of truly terrifying proportions. Wishpush lived in Lake Clay Elam and possessed the ability to control the fish that lived within those waters. But Wishpush was not a benevolent guardian of this abundance. Instead, he was a jealous hoarder, guarding the fish so greedily that the other animal people were starving. He had claimed the bounty for himself alone, and none of his fellow creatures could fish without incurring his wrath. This situation grew increasingly intolerable. The animal people faced a genuine crisis of survival. They needed access to the food resources that Wishpush controlled, but they lacked the power to challenge him directly. And so they turned to Coyote, recognizing something in his nature that suggested he might possess the cunning necessary to overcome such an obstacle. They approached him with a request that was equal parts prayer and practical appeal. They asked him to help them defeat Wishpush, to free the fish so that all could eat and survive. Coyote accepted this charge, recognizing in it both an opportunity for glory and a chance to exercise his particular gifts. He was not like the other spirits. He could not simply command through authority or overpower through sheer strength. But he possessed something perhaps more valuable, the ability to think in unusual ways, to see connections that others missed, to use cunning and manipulation to achieve ends that seemed impossible through direct confrontation. And so he set about devising a plan to deal with Wishpush. What Coyote understood, with that penetrating intelligence that characterized his nature, was that Wishpush's greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability. The beaver was powerful within the water, but his connection to that aquatic realm was also his limitation. He was bound to the lake, dependent upon it, unable to thrive far from its depths. Coyote's plan, therefore, involved drawing Wishpush out of his element, forcing him into a confrontation that would take place in a realm where his power was diminished and Coyote's cunning could operate more freely. Coyote transformed himself into a smaller beaver, a young one of remarkable beauty and apparent vulnerability. In this form he entered the waters of Lake Trialum, moving deliberately into a position where Wishpush could not help but notice him. The monstrous beaver, upon seeing what appeared to be an intruder in his domain, reacted with predictable rage. He lunged forward, attacking the smaller beaver form with all the fury of his immense bulk and power. This was precisely what Coyote had anticipated. He darted away, fleeing through the water with a speed that seemed almost miraculous given Wishpush's tremendous size. The chase was on. Coyote led Wishpush on a pursuit that lasted for what seemed like days. The enormous beaver followed, driven by rage and the determination to eliminate this presumptuous intruder from his territory. They raced through river systems and waterways, moving upstream with tremendous force and energy. Coyote maintained his distance, always staying just far enough ahead to avoid capture, always moving in a direction that served his deeper purpose. He guided Wishpush downstream and upstream, backwards and forwards, in a pattern that seemed chaotic but was actually precisely calculated. Finally, exhausted and enraged beyond reason, Wishpush made a mistake. He followed Coyote into shallower waters, into rapids and cascades where his immense size became a liability rather than an advantage. In these turbulent shallows, where the water churned and the rocks jutted upward, Wishpoosh found his movements restricted. It was in this moment of vulnerability that Coyote revealed his true form and struck. In one version of the story, he killed Wishpoosh directly with a magical weapon or through some sudden transformation. In other versions, the monstrous beaver was caught in the rapids and drowned, his body torn apart by the force of the current. The exact mechanism of his death varies depending on which tribal tradition preserves the tale, but the result was always the same. Wishpoosh was destroyed. And when Wishpoosh died, something remarkable occurred. His enormous body, freed at last from the control of his jealous consciousness, began to dissolve. As it did, it transformed into the landscape itself. The pieces of his corpse became the geographical features of the region, his bones became mountains and ridges, his blood became rivers and streams, and his smaller remains scattered across the land, becoming hills and valleys. But more importantly, his death removed the magical barrier that had prevented fish from thriving in the waters. The salmon and other fish that had been hoarded by Wishpoosh now became abundant, available to all the animal people who had suffered under the beaver's tyranny. The animal people rejoiced at this liberation, understanding that Coyote had accomplished what none of them could have done alone. But here's where the deeper teaching embedded in this story becomes apparent. Coyote had not destroyed Wishpoosh out of pure altruism or noble motivation. He had acted partly because he was asked, certainly, but also because the challenge amused him, because it allowed him to demonstrate his superiority and cunning, because it satisfied his ego and his love of dramatic action. The fact that his victory benefited others was, in some sense, a happy accident, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that it was a consequence that Coyote understood would follow from his actions, but which was not his primary motivation. This ambiguity is essential to understanding Coyote's role in Native American mythology. He is not a figure of pure good who happens to achieve good outcomes. Rather, he is a figure driven by impulses that are often selfish, petty, and self-serving. And yet these impulses frequently result in transformations that benefit all of creation. He represents the principle that chaos and selfishness can sometimes produce order and generosity, that foolish actions can sometimes generate wisdom, that the universe has a way of converting even the most self-interested motivations into instruments of broader benefit. In some traditions, after defeating Wishpoosh, Coyote goes on to perform other acts of transformation and preparation. He defeats other monsters and obstacles that prevent humanity from being able to inhabit the world. He steals fire and brings it to humanity, suffering terribly in the process, but ensuring that future generations would have access to warmth and the means to cook food and survive. He moves around the landscape, leaving markers and creating the conditions that would eventually allow the emergence of human beings into a world that had been prepared and made ready for their habitation. But Coyote's work is never truly finished. His transformations never result in permanent states of being. The order he creates always contains within it seeds of chaos that will eventually require addressing. The solutions he provides often generate new problems that will eventually need their own solutions. This is the fundamental nature of Coyote. He is not a figure who brings ultimate resolution or final answers. He is the spirit of transformation itself, the principle that nothing remains static, that change is constant, that order and chaos are always in relationship with one another, each containing the seeds of the other. Understanding both White Buffalo Calf Woman and Coyote gives us a more complete picture of how Native American cultures understood the sacred. White Buffalo Calf Woman represents the divine principle that seeks to establish order, ceremony, and enduring structures through which humans can maintain harmony and connection to the great mystery. Coyote represents the transformative force that prevents that order from becoming stagnant or oppressive, that challenges established patterns and forces evolution and change, sometimes through destruction and sometimes through surprising creativity. Together, they embody a vision of the cosmos as dynamic and alive, never settling into fixed patterns but always in motion, always generating new possibilities, even as it preserves what is most sacred. There is another figure of profound importance in Native American mythology, a being whose creative power rivals that of the greatest spirits, whose influence extends across multiple tribal traditions, and whose story illuminates something essential about the relationship between creation, sacrifice, and the emergence of human consciousness. I speak now of Spider-Woman, known among the Navajo people as Astsinadlihe, though she appears under different names and in different contexts throughout the traditions of the Southwest, the Pacific Northwest, and beyond. Spider-Woman represents something quite different from both White Buffalo Calf Woman and Coyote. Where White Buffalo Calf Woman brought order and ceremony from the divine realm, and where Coyote operates through cunning and transformation, Spider-Woman embodies the principle of creation itself, the weaving together of disparate threads into patterns of meaning and existence. She is, quite literally, the spinner of worlds, the artist who brings forth reality through her infinite patience and boundless creativity. To understand Spider-Woman is to understand something fundamental about how Native American cultures conceived of creation, craftsmanship, art, and the role of the feminine principle in bringing the cosmos into being. The origins of Spider-Woman exist in what the Navajo people call the worlds before this one, the lower worlds through which human consciousness had to pass before arriving in the current, fourth world where we now exist. According to Navajo cosmology, creation was not a single event but a process of emergence, a series of stages through which consciousness and form gradually manifested. In these earlier worlds, the people, though they weren't yet human in the form we know today, lived in states of increasing awareness and complexity. Each world represented a stage in the development of consciousness, a realm through which they had to journey before they could inhabit the world we know. It was in these lower worlds that Spider-Woman first encountered the people, and it was through her instruction that they began to understand the sacred arts of creation and making. Spider-Woman appeared to the people in those ancient times as a teacher and guide, just as White Buffalo Calf Woman would later appear to the Lakota. But her teachings were specifically about the creative arts, about weaving, about the transformation of raw materials into objects of beauty and utility, about the sacred geometry that underlies all patterns and forms. She taught the people that in the act of weaving, in the patient work of bringing threads together, they were participating in the very act of creation itself. Every weaving, every basket, every textile produced according to her teachings was not merely a utilitarian object or a work of art in the modern sense. It was a participation in the cosmic order, a way of bringing order and meaning into the material world through the disciplined application of skill, intention, and sacred knowledge. Among the Navajo people specifically, Spider-Woman became recognized as the teacher of weaving, the originator of the craft that has become so central to Navajo identity and spiritual practice. The Navajo loom itself is understood in spiritual terms, not merely as a tool but as a sacred space where the boundaries between the material and spiritual worlds become permeable. The act of weaving becomes a form of prayer, a meditation, a way of channeling spiritual power into physical form. And it was Spider-Woman who taught the ancient peoples to understand weaving in this sacred way, who showed them that every thread laid down on the loom was a thread in the great web of creation itself. But Spider-Woman's role extended far beyond the specific instruction in weaving techniques. She represented something much more fundamental about the nature of creation. In many Native American traditions, Spider-Woman is understood as the creator of all things, not in a monotheistic sense, but as the principle through which creation happens. She is the weaver who spins the web of existence, who connects all things to all other things through invisible filaments of energy and meaning. She is sometimes called the grandmother, acknowledging both her wisdom and her role as the source from which all things emerge. In some traditions, Spider-Woman is depicted as having emerged from the void or the primordial waters at the beginning of time. From her own being, her own creative essence, she began to spin. She created the earth beneath her, the sky above her, and the stars that populate the heavens. Every act of weaving that humans perform becomes, in this understanding, an imitation and honouring of Spider-Woman's original creative act. When a Navajo weaver sits at the loom, they are not simply producing a textile. They are participating in an ongoing conversation with creation itself. They are continuing the work that Spider-Woman began, and they are expressing, through pattern, colour, and form, their own understanding of the sacred order. The spiritual significance of Spider-Woman appears most clearly when we understand what happened when the people were preparing to emerge into the fourth world, the world in which we currently live. According to Navajo teachings, as the people approached the moment of emergence, they gathered together to discuss what they should bring with them into this new world. They understood that they would be leaving behind the lower worlds, the realms of learning and preparation, and entering into a new phase of existence. This transition was not to be taken lightly. Everything they chose to bring with them, every skill, every ceremony, every sacred object, would shape their destiny in this new world. Among all the things they considered bringing, it was Spider-Woman who spoke most urgently about one particular necessity. She insisted that the art of weaving, the knowledge of how to work the loom, must be brought into the fourth world. Other teachings and practices might be adapted or transformed as they moved to this new realm, but the sacred craft of weaving must be preserved in its essential form. She explained that weaving would not be merely a practical skill through which the people could create clothing and shelter. Rather, it would be a spiritual discipline through which the people could maintain their connection to the cosmic order, through which they could continue to participate in the ongoing act of creation. And so it came to pass that as the people emerged into the fourth world, they brought with them the knowledge of weaving, the understanding of the loom, and the spiritual teachings associated with this sacred craft. Spider-Woman did not emerge physically into the fourth world, at least not in the form she had inhabited in the lower worlds. Rather, her presence continued through the memory of her teaching, through the continuation of the craft she had originated, and through the understanding that every weaving performed according to the proper ways was a form of prayer and participation in the sacred. In the traditions of the Hopi people, who are neighbours to the Navajo and share many related cultural practices and beliefs, Spider-Woman takes on a name and role with slightly different emphasis. She is called Kokopelli, which translates roughly as Spider Grandmother. In Hopi cosmology, Kokopelli plays a role even more central to the process of creation and emergence. According to some Hopi accounts, it was Spider-Woman who actually created the humans, not by giving birth to them in a conventional sense, but by weaving them into being. She created humanity from the earth and her own creative power, just as she weaves cloth from threads. The Hopi understand the emergence into the current world as having occurred through a series of kivas, ceremonial chambers, which served as passages between worlds. Spider-Woman was present at these passages, guiding the people through the transitions from one world to the next. She offered instruction and wisdom at each stage, preparing the people for what they would encounter as they climbed upward and emerged into new realms of existence. Her patience, her knowledge, and her willingness to remain present through all the trials and challenges of this journey made her indispensable to the survival and development of the people. In some Hopi traditions, there is a particularly beautiful image associated with Spider-Woman's role in creation. It is said that she carried the people through the lower worlds in a basket, a woven basket that was itself a work of her artistry. This basket served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a practical vessel, a way of transporting the people safely. But it was also a symbol of the womb, the space from which new life emerges, and it was a representation of the web itself, the interconnected patterns through which all existence is organized. In this image, we see how Spider-Woman combines practical wisdom with spiritual significance, how she understands that the material and spiritual worlds are not separate but are woven together inextricably. The teachings of Spider-Woman have particular relevance in contemporary times, though this understanding requires us to step beyond the purely mythological and consider how ancient wisdom speaks to modern concerns. Many indigenous peoples today emphasize that the teachings of Spider-Woman remain relevant to the environmental and social challenges facing both native communities and the world at large. Spider-Woman's vision of creation as a web in which all things are connected through invisible filaments offers a counterpoint to Western conceptions of the world as a collection of separate, competing entities. When Spider-Woman weaves her web, every thread matters, every strand contributes to the integrity of the whole. If one crucial thread is broken, the entire structure is weakened. This understanding speaks directly to ecological awareness and to the current crisis facing the natural world. The destruction of a single species, the pollution of a single river system, the clear cutting of a forest, these are not isolated incidents but threads broken in the great web of existence. When we damage the earth and its ecosystems in the name of convenience or profit, we are, in effect, unraveling the sacred web that holds us all in relationship and sustenance. Furthermore, Spider-Woman's teachings about patience and careful craftsmanship offer a rebuke to the haste and carelessness that characterizes much of modern production and consumption. When a Navajo weaver creates a textile according to the traditional teachings of Spider-Woman, the process cannot be rushed. The weaver must maintain focus and intention throughout hours and days of labor. The quality of the finished product depends not merely on the skill of the weaver, but on the respect and care brought to every moment of the work. In a world of mass production and disposable goods, this insistence on quality, care, and sacred attention represents a profound alternative vision. Some contemporary Navajo weavers speak of how they maintain connection with Spider-Woman's teachings, even in the modern world. They describe the meditative quality of weaving, how the repetitive motions of working the loom can induce states of deep focus and spiritual awareness. They speak of how patterns emerge that the weaver didn't consciously plan, suggesting that the work is being guided by something beyond the individual consciousness. Perhaps by the presence of Spider-Woman herself, working through the hands of the weaver to express patterns and designs that carry spiritual significance. The teaching of Spider-Woman extends beyond weaving in its literal sense to encompass a more metaphorical understanding of creative work. All acts of creation, whether they involve physical materials or whether they involve the weaving together of ideas, communities, or spiritual practices, can be understood as participating in Spider-Woman's original creative act. A teacher who weaves together knowledge in ways that transform the consciousness of students is doing Spider-Woman's work. A healer who weaves together physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of healing is working in the tradition of Spider-Woman. A community organizer who weaves together disparate groups into a united whole is continuing Spider-Woman's sacred labor. This is why Spider-Woman holds such enduring significance in Native American culture and consciousness. She represents not merely a historical figure or a character from ancient mythology. Rather, she embodies a principle, the principle that creation is ongoing, that it requires patience and skill, that it involves bringing separate things into meaningful relationships, and that all such creative work participates in something sacred and cosmic. As long as humans continue to make things, to create beauty, to organize chaos into patterns of meaning, Spider-Woman remains present. Her teachings continue to guide those who choose to work with intention and awareness. The relationship between the mythological figures we've explored, White Buffalo Calf Woman, Coyote, and Spider-Woman, reveals something essential about how Native American cultures understood the cosmos and the divine. White Buffalo Calf Woman brings order and ceremony, Coyote brings transformation and challenge to that order, and Spider-Woman provides the underlying principle through which all creation and all becoming occur. Together, these figures represent different aspects of reality and different modes through which consciousness can engage with existence. Together, they create a comprehensive vision of the sacred, one in which creation is not a single event, but an ongoing process, in which spiritual power takes many forms, and in which human beings have a meaningful role to play in the continuation of creation itself. Now that we have explored the creative principles embodied in Spider-Woman, the weaving together of threads into patterns of meaning, we must turn our attention to a figure of equally profound significance, one whose dominion extends across the skies and whose presence is felt in every storm and tempest. We speak now of the Thunderbird, a being whose power rivals that of the greatest celestial spirits, whose influence extends across more tribal traditions than perhaps any other figure in Native American mythology, and whose story reveals something essential about humanity's relationship with the raw, untamed forces of nature itself. The Thunderbird appears throughout the mythology and spiritual traditions of tribes stretching from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains, from the northeastern woodlands to the territories of the Southwest. Unlike many of the figures we've explored thus far, whose significance tends to be concentrated within the traditions of specific tribal nations, the Thunderbird transcends these boundaries. The Lakota know this being. The tribes of the Pacific Northwest recognize its presence, the Algonquin peoples revere it, and the Ojibwe hold it as sacred. This widespread recognition suggests something profound, that across the vast expanse of the North American continent, diverse peoples arrived at remarkably similar understandings of this spiritual principle, this entity that dwells in the realms above humanity, commanding the skies and wielding powers that can nurture or destroy with equal force. In the languages of various tribes, the Thunderbird has been given different names, each carrying particular significance. Among the Lakota and Dakota peoples, it is called Wokinyan, a name that translates as the Winged One, though this simple translation barely captures the profound resonance the term carries. In the traditions of the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe peoples of the Great Lakes region, the being is known as Animikiai. In other traditions, it is simply referred to by descriptive names that emphasize its most striking characteristic: the bird of thunder, the maker of lightning, the creature whose wings create the sound that rolls across the sky and shakes the earth beneath our feet. What makes the Thunderbird distinct from other great spirits is the particular way it manifests in the physical world. While Spider-Woman's presence is felt primarily through the creative acts of human beings, and while Coyote operates through transformation and cunning, the Thunderbird announces itself through the most powerful and undeniable phenomena of nature. When thunder crashes across the sky and lightning illuminates the darkness, when the rains pour down in torrents that can nourish the earth or devastate it, when the wind rises with terrible force and the clouds gather in formations that seem to possess their own consciousness and will, in all these moments, the Thunderbird is present. The very sky itself becomes the realm of this great spirit's activity. To understand the Thunderbird, we must recognize that it is depicted not merely as a mythological abstraction or a symbolic principle, but as a real being of almost incomprehensible size and power. In the traditions of the Pacific Northwest tribes, the Thunderbird is described as being so enormous that it can carry a whale in its talons. And we must remember that this is not hyperbolic exaggeration in the manner of tall tales. In the understanding of the peoples who told these stories, this was a literal description of reality, or at least of a reality that existed on a different plane than ordinary human perception, but which was nonetheless real in its effects and manifestations. The Thunderbird's appearance, according to numerous traditions, is both magnificent and terrifying. It is typically depicted with wings spread wide in flight, with a large hooked beak capable of incredible strength, and often adorned with feathers of brilliant colours. In the traditions of the Great Plains peoples, the Thunderbird is sometimes portrayed in one of four colours: red, blue, green, or yellow, each colour representing one of the four sacred directions and the winds that blow from those directions. In other traditions, the Thunderbird's symbol is a zigzag pattern that resembles a lightning bolt, emphasizing the inextricable connection between this creature and the electrical fury that tears through the sky during storms. But the Thunderbird's most distinctive features are those through which it manifests thunder and lightning. According to widespread tradition, the thunder that crashes through the sky is created by the beating of the Thunderbird's massive wings. When this great being flaps its wings with tremendous force, the sound that emerges is the thunderclap that can be heard for miles across the land. The rolling thunder that continues after the initial crash is understood to be the sound of the younger Thunderbirds, the offspring or the lesser beings of this species, also beating their wings and contributing to the great symphony of sound that accompanies a storm. The lightning, in turn, is understood to come from the Thunderbird's eyes. According to many traditions, lightning shoots forth from the creature's gaze with tremendous force and speed, illuminating the darkness and striking the earth with destructive power. In some accounts, the Thunderbird is said to fashion a great bow from its own wings, and lightning bolts are the arrows it shoots from this celestial weapon, aimed at targets on the earth below. In other traditions, the lightning is understood more directly. It is simply the flash that occurs when the Thunderbird blinks its enormous eyes, a moment of connection between the celestial realm and the world below. The rain itself is understood in some traditions to fall from a great lake that the Thunderbird carries upon its back. Imagine the majesty and terror of this concept, a creature so vast that it bears within itself an entire body of water from which the life-giving rains fall upon the earth. When the Thunderbird flies across the sky, when conditions are right, when the balance between the upper world and the lower world requires replenishment, this cosmic lake is released and the rains fall. In this understanding, the Thunderbird does not merely create weather phenomena, it is the very embodiment of the cycle through which water is drawn up from the earth, ascends to the sky, and returns again in the form of nourishing rain. Now, the nature of the Thunderbird's relationship with humanity is complex and multifaceted. In the most basic sense, the Thunderbird is understood as a protector. It defends human beings against the evil spirits of the underworld, against malevolent forces that would seek to harm or destroy humanity. In many traditions, particularly those of the Algonquin peoples, the Thunderbird is understood as the ruler of the upper world, locked in eternal struggle with the great horned serpent, which is the ruler of the underworld. The Thunderbird shoots lightning down at the creatures that serve the serpent, protecting the surface world and the human beings who dwell upon it. But the Thunderbird's protection is not gentle or without cost. This is where we encounter the essential paradox at the heart of Thunderbird mythology. The same power that brings the nourishing rains can bring torrential floods that destroy everything in their path. The same force that protects humanity from evil spirits can strike down human beings themselves, seemingly without warning or reason. Lightning does not discriminate. The Thunderbird's protective power is real, but it operates according to principles that are not always comprehensible to human understanding. The being exists on a scale and according to a logic that transcends human moral categories of good and evil, mercy and cruelty. This paradoxical nature of the Thunderbird is revealed most clearly in the great battle narratives that appear in various tribal traditions. Among the Lakota peoples, there exists a profound story of how the Thunderbird, in its aspect as Wakan Tunka, a term sometimes used for the supreme creative force, came to the aid of humanity in a moment of terrible crisis. According to these teachings, there came a time when an evil spirit of the underworld, known as Unkdehi, decided that she would destroy all of humanity. She was motivated by dislike for any creature unlike herself, and she determined that the only solution was to flood the entire earth and wash away all the people. This being, Unkdehi, possessed the ability to swell her own body to enormous proportions. She expanded herself to fill all the oceans, rivers and streams, leaving no room for the water that normally flowed through these channels. The result was a great flood that rose up and covered the entire earth, except for the highest mountain peaks. The truthful, pure, and loyal human beings fled to these mountains to escape the waters, but it seemed that their doom was certain. There was nowhere left for them to go, and Unkdehi's waters continued to rise. It was at this moment of ultimate desperation that Wakan Tunka, the Thunderbird in its highest aspect, perceived what was occurring and resolved to intervene. The great being first descended to the waters to battle Unkdehi directly, but found that fighting the underworld spirit in her own element, in the water, was a losing proposition. Wakan Tunka suffered many wounds in this initial confrontation and realized that direct combat in the underwater realm would not result in victory. And so the Thunderbird withdrew to the sky, its natural realm, and called together all the Thunderbirds and their young to a great council. Here, in the clouds above the world, a momentous decision was made. Rather than fighting Unkdehi in her world of water, it was determined that the Thunderbirds would fight from their own world, the sky itself. They would employ their most powerful weapon, the force that is the very essence of their being. At a predetermined moment, all the Thunderbirds released their lightning bolts simultaneously. Imagine the magnitude of this event. Countless bolts of pure electrical fury shot from the sky all at once, striking the waters below. The effect was catastrophic and transformative. The waters boiled beneath the onslaught of lightning. Unkdehi was burned and destroyed by the tremendous force of this coordinated strike. The forests that covered the land were consumed by the flames that accompanied the lightning. The earth itself became desolate, scorched and barren from the intensity of the assault. But from the bones of Unkdehi, which had turned to stone through the heat and the magical transformation, the landscape was reformed. These bones can still be found in riverbeds across the earth to this day, visible testimony to the great battle that saved humanity from complete annihilation. And after the destruction came renewal. Wakan Tunka, the Thunderbird in its supreme aspect, caused the rain to fall again, rain that was gentle and nourishing rather than destructive. This rain fell upon the scorched earth and revived it. The people who had taken refuge on the mountain peaks came down and found that the land had been renewed. Food and water were available. They flourished and multiplied, knowing that they had been saved by the Thunderbird's power and sacrifice. This story reveals something essential about how Native American cultures understood the relationship between humanity and the great forces of nature. The Thunderbird is not depicted as a benevolent guardian who will always protect humanity without cost. Rather, it is presented as a being of tremendous power that can be called upon in moments of ultimate crisis, but which operates according to its own nature and its own laws. When the Thunderbird acts, it acts with an intensity and totality that encompasses both destruction and creation. The very weapons that save humanity, the lightning bolts, the rain, are the same forces that can devastate and destroy. In the traditions of the Groffontre people, the Thunderbird takes on a somewhat different significance. Among this nation, it is believed that it was the Thunderbird who gave the sacred pipe to the people. This connection links the Thunderbird not only to the raw forces of nature, but also to the spiritual teachings and the sacred objects through which humanity maintains its connection to the divine. In this understanding, the Thunderbird is a bringer of gifts as well as a wielder of destructive power, a being whose nature encompasses both generosity and fury. Some Plains tribes, including the Arapaho, associated the Thunderbird with the summer season, understanding this great bird as a seasonal force whose influence varies throughout the year. In this tradition, there is an opposite being known as the White Owl, which represents the winter season. Together, these two beings create the cycle of seasons, the rhythm through which the year unfolds. The Thunderbird brings the warm season with its growth and abundance, while the White Owl brings the cold season with its dormancy and rest. Neither is superior to the other. Both are necessary for the maintenance of balance and harmony in the natural world. In the mythology of the Menominee people of Wisconsin, the Thunderbird takes on yet another aspect. Here, the Thunderbird is understood as a guardian of noble character, and it is believed to reside atop a floating mountain that exists in the sky. From this exalted position, the Thunderbird controls the reins of nature itself, governing the winds and the storms according to principles that reflect the highest moral values. The Menominee understand each individual Thunderbird as representing different aspects of nature, symbolized through various colors and directions. These Thunderbirds are also conceived of as warriors who battle against the great horned snakes, known as Misikinubik, serpentine beings of the underworld, protecting humanity through their celestial combat. Now, it is crucial to understand that the Thunderbird, despite its universal recognition across Native American cultures, does not have a single unified mythology. Rather, each tribal tradition has adapted the concept of the Thunderbird to reflect particular aspects of their own environment, their own spiritual understanding, and their own relationship with the natural world. For the Pacific Northwest tribes, living in a region of tremendous precipitation and dramatic weather, the Thunderbird manifests with particular vividness and power. For the Plains tribes, living in a landscape where thunder can be heard for miles across open grasslands, where lightning strikes are visible from great distances, and where the sudden arrival of storms can be matters of life and death, the Thunderbird takes on characteristics suited to this environment. Yet through all these variations, certain core understandings remain consistent. The Thunderbird is always understood as a being of immense power. It is always associated with thunder, lightning, and rain. It is always depicted as a protector of humanity, though a protector whose methods are not gentle or easily understood. It is always conceived of as existing in realms above ordinary human experience, dwelling in the clouds and the sky, operating according to principles that transcend human moral categories. The Thunderbird's significance in Native American cultures extends far beyond mythological narrative into the realm of spiritual practice and sacred symbolism. The image of the Thunderbird appears prominently in the art of numerous tribes, in totem poles of the Pacific Northwest, in the rock art and petroglyphs that mark sacred sites, in the beadwork and quillwork of the Plains peoples, in the ceremonial objects and sacred bundles maintained by tribal communities. To see or to create an image of the Thunderbird is to participate in a spiritual act, to connect oneself with this tremendous power, and to acknowledge one's awareness of the forces that govern existence. In some traditions, the Thunderbird is directly associated with medicine and healing power. The Sioux people, for instance, believed that where lightning bolts struck the ground, medicine stones were formed. These stones were thought to possess tremendous magical power, and were highly valued by medicine men and spiritual practitioners. To possess such a stone was to have a direct connection to the Thunderbird's power, to carry within one's possession something that bore the mark of the divine. The moral and spiritual dimensions of Thunderbird mythology are equally important. The Thunderbird is often presented not merely as a force of nature, but as a being that embodies spiritual principles and values. In many traditions, the Thunderbird is associated with truth, purity, loyalty, and duty to human beings. These qualities are not presented as soft or sentimental virtues, but rather as principles that require strength and commitment to maintain. The Thunderbird, with its tremendous power and its willingness to engage in battle against evil forces, is presented as the ultimate embodiment of these qualities. A being that does not simply speak of truth and loyalty, but demonstrates these qualities through action and sacrifice. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of Thunderbird mythology, the understanding that this being, despite its immense power, is not an abstract principle or a distant deity indifferent to human concerns. Rather, the Thunderbird is understood as being intimately involved in human affairs, as caring about the fate of humanity, and as willing to intervene directly in human destiny when circumstances warrant such intervention. The Thunderbird is not a god who remains aloof in the heavens, unconcerned with the doings of mortals below. Rather, it is a being who sees what transpires on the earth, who judges the actions of human beings according to spiritual principles, and who acts decisively when it perceives that the balance between good and evil, between creation and destruction, has been tipped toward chaos and malevolence. In the context of contemporary Native American spirituality and culture, the Thunderbird continues to hold profound significance. Tribal nations maintain teachings about the Thunderbird in their oral traditions and ceremonial practices. The image of the Thunderbird appears in contemporary Native American art and continues to inspire artists and spiritual practitioners. Young people within indigenous communities learn the teachings of the Thunderbird as part of their education in tribal ways and spiritual understanding. The Thunderbird serves as a reminder that humanity exists within a much larger cosmos, that forces exist beyond human understanding and control, and that genuine power is not measured in human terms, but in terms of one's alignment with cosmic principles and one's capacity to serve something greater than oneself. The Thunderbird also represents a particular understanding of power itself, one that stands in stark contrast to many Western conceptions. In the Thunderbird mythology, true power is not conceived of as something that one possesses and hoards for personal benefit. Rather, power is something that flows through a being, something that comes from alignment with cosmic forces and with the greater whole. The Thunderbird is powerful not because it dominates others, but because it serves purposes larger than itself. It brings the rain that nourishes all living things. It protects humanity from destructive underworld forces. It maintains the balance between sky and earth, between upper and lower worlds. This is true power, the capacity to serve the greater good even when that service requires tremendous effort and even sacrifice. In this way, the Thunderbird mythology speaks directly to contemporary concerns about the use of power, about the relationship between individual strength and communal well-being, and about the responsibility that comes with possessing great abilities. The Thunderbird does not use its power carelessly or for personal aggrandizement. When it strikes with lightning, it does so for a purpose. When it brings the rain, it does so to sustain life. When it battles the forces of the underworld, it does so to protect those who cannot protect themselves. We have now explored three great figures in Native American mythology: White Buffalo Calf Woman, who brings order and sacred teachings; Coyote, who brings transformation and challenge; and Spider Woman, who embodies the principle of creation through patient, careful weaving. and now the Thunderbird, who brings protection and the raw power of nature itself. Together, these beings represent a comprehensive vision of the sacred cosmos, one in which creation unfolds through multiple principles and forces, in which power manifests in diverse forms, and in which human beings have a meaningful place within a much larger whole. Having explored the tremendous power of the Thunderbird, that great being of the sky whose protection comes through force and whose presence shakes the earth itself, we now turn our attention to a figure of quite a different character. Where the Thunderbird commands through raw power and celestial authority, the figure we now encounter moves quietly through villages and across landscapes, carrying gifts and music, bringing joy and fertility through an entirely different kind of magic. This is Kokopelli, one of the most enduring and recognizable figures in Native American mythology, a being whose image has been carved into stone and preserved in petroglyphs for more than 3,000 years, whose presence in southwestern cultures is so fundamental that to understand the spirituality of the Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, the Navajo, the Zuni, and numerous other nations requires understanding Kokopelli's role in their cosmological understanding. Unlike the other great spirits we have encountered, Kokopelli is often depicted not in a state of cosmic grandeur or terrifying majesty, but rather in a humble and almost comical form. He is typically portrayed as a small figure, somewhat bent over, with a distinctive humpback that curves upward from his shoulders. This hump is not a deformity in the modern sense, rather it is a container, a vessel, a sack through which he carries the gifts that define his purpose and his role in the world. Upon his head, in many depictions, he wears feathers or antenna-like protrusions that seem to connect him to the realms beyond ordinary perception. And most distinctively, he carries a flute, an instrument of profound spiritual significance through which his power flows and through which he communicates with the world around him. The image of Kokopelli is ubiquitous throughout the Southwest. He appears in petroglyphs carved into rock faces, in paintings and drawings that have been preserved through centuries, in the decorative arts of Pueblo pottery, in the ceremonial objects and sacred bundles maintained by tribal communities. If the Thunderbird represents the awesome power of the divine reaching down from the heavens, Kokopelli represents the divine walking humbly among human beings, engaging with them directly, offering gifts and participating in the intimate processes through which human life and agricultural abundance are sustained. To understand Kokopelli is to recognize that Native American spirituality encompasses not only the grand cosmic forces, but also the intimate, personal dimensions of existence. Kokopelli presides over fertility, both human fertility and agricultural fertility. He is a god of abundance and plenty, of the successful harvest and the continuation of the people through new life. But he is also something more complex than this simple description suggests. Kokopelli is a trickster, a wanderer, a musician, a storyteller, and in many traditions, a figure of erotic power and sexual abundance. He is simultaneously sacred and profane, serious and playful, benevolent and mischievous. The origins of Kokopelli are shrouded in the mists of time. Some scholars suggest that the figure may have originated as a representation of traveling traders who moved between villages carrying goods and announcing their arrival through music. These traders, it is theorized, may have introduced agricultural knowledge, seeds, and goods from distant regions, and over time their historical role became transformed into spiritual significance through the mythological imagination of the peoples they encountered. Other traditions suggest that Kokopelli originated as a deity associated with insects, particularly cicadas and locusts whose sounds fill the desert landscape with music during certain seasons. The connection between Kokopelli and insects is particularly evident in some variations of his mythology, where his hump transforms him into an insect-like creature. But perhaps the most widespread understanding is that Kokopelli is simply an ancient deity whose origins are lost in time, a being who has been recognized and revered across multiple tribal nations for reasons that are understood intuitively rather than historically. He appears in the mythologies of peoples who had little historical contact with one another, suggesting that perhaps Kokopelli represents a principle so fundamental to human experience, fertility, music, joy, the continuation of life, that it emerges independently in the spiritual traditions of diverse cultures. In the traditions of the Hopi people, Kokopelli takes on a particularly significant role. Among the Hopi, Kokopelli is understood as a being who carries unborn children within his hump. He travels from village to village, and when he encounters women, particularly young unmarried women, he distributes these children to them, thereby ensuring that the people continue and that population remains stable. This role makes Kokopelli a figure of profound importance to Hopi understanding of birth, fertility, and the continuation of the nation. However, it also makes him a somewhat ambiguous figure, for there are traditions in which young girls fear Kokopelli's arrival, understanding that encounter with him may result in pregnancy. This ambiguity, the understanding that fertility and the continuation of life, while essential and sacred, also carries dimensions that can be frightening or unwanted, reflects a sophisticated understanding of the complexity of human sexuality and reproduction. In Hopi ceremonies, Kokopelli plays an important role in rituals related to marriage and fertility. He is sometimes depicted with a consort, a female figure known as Kokopelmimi, and together they represent the principle of creative union, of the masculine and feminine principles coming together to generate new life. The Hopi also believe that Kokopelli can be seen on the full moon and the waning moon, much like other figures that appear in lunar mythology across many cultures. This celestial association suggests that Kokopelli's influence extends beyond the earthly realm and participates in the cosmic cycles that govern time and the seasons. In the mythology of the Navajo people, Kokopelli takes on a somewhat different but related character. Among the Navajo, Kokopelli is understood as a god of harvest and plenty, a minor deity who brings abundance to the people. His hump, in Navajo tradition, is filled not merely with children but with seeds, clouds, and rainbows. This elaboration of what Kokopelli carries reflects the Navajo environment and concerns. In a landscape where water is precious and where successful agriculture depends on adequate rainfall, Kokopelli's association with clouds and rain becomes crucial to his significance. When Kokopelli appears, the people understand that he brings with him the possibility of rain, of abundant crops, of plenty and sustenance. In Zuni tradition, Kokopelli takes on yet another role. The Zuni understand Kokopelli as a rain priest, a spiritual being with healing powers who possesses the ability to call down rain at will. In some Zuni accounts, Kokopelli is depicted as playing his flute to summon the thunder beings, those great spirits of the sky, to come and make love to the earth herself. This union between the masculine principle of the sky beings and the feminine principle of the earth results in fertility and abundance. Crops grow, animals thrive, and the people prosper. In this understanding, Kokopelli serves as an intermediary between the celestial realm and the terrestrial realm, using his music to establish communication and connection between these domains. The most distinctive and characteristic feature of Kokopelli is, of course, his flute. The flute is not merely a musical instrument in the ordinary sense. Rather, it is a sacred object through which spiritual power flows. When Kokopelli plays his flute, several things occur simultaneously, according to various traditions. The music brings joy and happiness to those who hear it. The melody is understood to possess magical properties that can transform the landscape itself. As Kokopelli plays, winter is driven away and spring arrives. Snow melts, rivers flow with renewed vigor, and the earth awakens from dormancy to abundance. Crops that have been withered and dying begin to flourish. The very vibrations of the flute's music are understood to penetrate into the soil and awaken the seeds that lie dormant there. In some traditions, the flute music of Kokopelli has the power to inspire creativity and artistic expression. Those who hear the music may find themselves suddenly capable of creating beauty, whether through art, through music, through dance, or through other forms of creative expression that might not have been accessible to them before. The flute is understood to open channels of creativity that exist within all people, but are often blocked or suppressed by the concerns and anxieties of ordinary life. When Kokopelli plays, these channels are opened, and people are free to express themselves and to experience the joy that comes from creative expression. There exists a profound story in the mythologies of the Pueblo peoples that illuminates the deeper significance of Kokopelli's role. According to this account, there came a time when the world was in a state of drought and famine. The crops had failed, the rivers had diminished to mere trickles, the people were suffering, and it seemed that their survival was in question. In this moment of crisis, Kokopelli appeared to them. He came bearing a sacred bundle, and within this bundle were seeds, not ordinary seeds, but seeds of such power and significance that they possessed the ability to transform the destiny of the people. According to some versions of this story, a great serpent appeared to Kokopelli and gave him sacred seeds of corn. These were not merely the seeds of ordinary maize. These were seeds that carried within them the spiritual essence of the corn plant, seeds that embodied the principle of growth and nourishment itself. Kokopelli consumed most of these seeds, and in doing so he transformed. The seeds accumulated within his hump, and the very act of carrying them caused his back to bend and curve. He became, in a sense, a living container for the sacred seeds, his body transformed by the weight and significance of what he carried. The seeds that Kokopelli did not consume began to scatter around him as he travelled and played his flute. As he moved through the landscape, these seeds were carried by the wind. Some fell to the ground and took root immediately, beginning to grow. Others were carried far distances before settling into soil where they could germinate. And as Kokopelli played his flute, the seeds themselves seemed to dance, moving through the air as though animated by the music, seeking out the places where they could take root and flourish. In one particularly significant version of this story, a great cornstalk grew from the seeds that Kokopelli had scattered. This cornstalk was of such tremendous proportions that it seemed to touch the sky itself. It grew so tall that it reached from the earthly realm into the upper worlds, into the inner worlds, into the spiritual dimensions that exist alongside and interpenetrate with ordinary reality. Kokopelli appeared beside this great stalk and began to climb it, continuing to play his flute as he ascended. The people who had been following Kokopelli, who had witnessed his scattering of the sacred seeds, and who had begun to understand the significance of what he was doing, followed him up the stalk. As they climbed, something remarkable occurred. The world below them began to fade and transform. The cornstalk itself seemed to become a passageway between worlds. The people who climbed it found themselves moving from the first inner world through the second inner world and into the third inner world. In each of these transitional realms, they encountered teaching and transformation. Those who carried seeds that they had captured from the air found themselves transformed into the inner world Kachinas, spiritual beings who would serve to preserve and perpetuate the knowledge and the gifts that Kokopelli had distributed. Finally, Kokopelli guided the people into the fourth world, the current world in which we now exist. In this world, the seeds that Kokopelli carried were planted, and from this point forward, corn became the foundation of human civilization in the southwest. It became the substance through which the people sustained themselves. It became sacred, a gift from Kokopelli, a visible reminder of his role in ensuring human survival and the continuation of the people. Many scholars and storytellers understand this myth as a way of encoding the historical transition from a nomadic, hunter-gatherer way of life to an agricultural, settled way of life. The story of Kokopelli and the sacred corn seeds can be understood as a mythological account of how the peoples of the Southwest adopted agriculture and began to build civilizations based on the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash. But this historical understanding does not exhaust the meaning of the story. On a deeper level, the myth speaks to the principle that guides all transformation. The idea that change requires guidance, that seeds must be scattered for new growth to occur, that the journey from one state of being to another involves passage through multiple realms of experience and understanding. What makes Kokopelli distinct from many other fertility deities in world mythology is the degree to which he is understood as a trickster figure. In many traditions, fertility deities are portrayed as dignified and serious, concerned primarily with the propagation of life in a straightforward and solemn manner. But Kokopelli is depicted with a playfulness and a prankish quality that reflects the reality that fertility and sexuality, while sacred, are also occasions for humor, pleasure, and sometimes chaos or discomfort. In particular, Kokopelli is depicted in many traditions as engaging in seduction. He is sometimes portrayed as tricking young women, particularly the most beautiful women in the village, into intimate relations with him. In some accounts, the morning after Kokopelli has passed through a village, every maiden finds herself with child. This aspect of Kokopelli mythology has sometimes been sanitized or downplayed in modern retellings, but it is crucial to understanding his full character. Kokopelli represents the force of sexuality and desire itself, a force that is necessary for the continuation of the people, but which is also wild, unpredictable, and not always subject to human control or moral categories. He is not a force to be condemned or rejected, but he is also not a force that can be entirely domesticated or made to serve human purposes according to human preferences. This aspect of Kokopelli has led some anthropologists and scholars to theorize that the trickster figure, in general, serves a particular function in indigenous cultures. The trickster, through his violation of norms and his disregard for social categories, provides what might be called a cultural release valve. He allows expression of impulses and desires that must be suppressed in ordinary social life. By telling stories about the trickster's exploits and transgressions, a culture can acknowledge the reality of these impulses while still maintaining social order. Kokopelli, in his role as a trickster fertility deity, fulfills this function while also ensuring that the sacred force of sexuality and fertility is recognized and honored. The flute itself has profound symbolic significance in Kokopelli mythology. The flute is an instrument through which breath becomes sound, through which the inner essence of the musician is expressed externally. In many Native American traditions, breath is understood as synonymous with life itself. It is the first thing that emerges when a being is born, and the last thing that departs when death occurs. To play a flute is to externalize one's life force, to project one's essence into the world through the medium of music. Kokopelli's flute music is understood to have the power to bring warmth to the earth. Some traditions speak of Kokopelli's flute being heard in the spring breeze itself, that the warming winds of spring are literally the sound of Kokopelli's music, made visible and tangible through its effects on temperature and the awakening of the earth. Other traditions suggest that Kokopelli's flute playing is so powerful that it can call the sun itself to listen, causing it to return more powerfully after the winter months have passed. In some Pueblo traditions, Kokopelli is understood as a wandering minstrel who does not himself create music, but rather carries music songs that he has collected from throughout the world. According to these accounts, Kokopelli travels from village to village, trading old songs for new ones. He arrives in a community, plays the songs he has collected, and then gathers new songs from the people he encounters before moving on to the next village. In this role, Kokopelli serves as a kind of cosmic cultural exchange agent, ensuring that different peoples and regions remain connected through the medium of music and song. He prevents cultures from becoming isolated and stagnant, instead facilitating the flow of artistic expression and creative inspiration between communities. The image of Kokopelli appears prominently in the rock art and petroglyphs of the Southwest, suggesting that his significance in Native American spiritual life extends back many centuries. These ancient carvings serve as a kind of permanent testimony to Kokopelli's enduring importance. When someone sees a Kokopelli petroglyph carved into a rock face in the desert, they are connecting with thousands of years of spiritual tradition, participating in an act of recognition and acknowledgement that stretches across centuries. It is important to understand that Kokopelli is not a figure who operates according to the principle of order and law, like White Buffalo Calf Woman, nor is he simply a force of chaos and transformation, like Coyote. Rather, Kokopelli represents a principle that is necessary for the continuation of human life, but which operates according to its own logic, not according to human categories of control or understanding. He is a wanderer, not settling in any one place, always moving to the next village, the next community, the next opportunity to spread fertility and joy. In contemporary times, the image of Kokopelli has become one of the most widely recognized symbols of the American Southwest. His image appears on t-shirts, pottery, jewelry, and countless decorative items. He has become, in some sense, a symbol of the Southwest itself, conjuring images of deserts and mesas, of ancient cultures and spiritual traditions, of a landscape that is beautiful and sacred. While this widespread adoption of the Kokopelli image has sometimes resulted in a certain dilution of his spiritual significance, it also testifies to the power of this figure to capture human imagination and to communicate something essential about the beauty, fertility, and spiritual richness of the southwestern landscape. Yet beneath the commercialization and the contemporary adaptation of Kokopelli's image, the ancient teachings remain vital and significant. Kokopelli continues to represent the principle that life requires movement, that abundance flows from the willingness to travel and share, that joy and creativity are as essential to human flourishing as food and shelter. He reminds us that fertility is not merely a biological phenomenon, but a spiritual principle that encompasses all forms of growth, creation, and transformation. He teaches that music and art are not luxuries, but sacred necessities, expressions of the life force itself. When we consider Kokopelli in the context of the other great spirits we have explored, White Buffalo Calf Woman with her teachings and ceremonies, Coyote with his cunning transformations, Spider Woman with her patient weaving, and the Thunderbird with its awesome power, we begin to see the comprehensiveness of Native American spiritual vision. These figures do not represent a belief system in the modern sense, but rather they represent principles through which the cosmos organizes itself and through which human beings can understand their place within that cosmos. White Buffalo Calf Woman teaches that order and structure are necessary. Coyote teaches that no structure remains static, transformation and challenge are inevitable. Spider-Woman teaches that creation is an ongoing process requiring patience and skill. The Thunderbird teaches that power must ultimately serve something greater than itself. And Kokopelli teaches that joy, music, and creativity are not peripheral to life, but central to its meaning and its continuation. He teaches that the sacred operates not only through grand cosmic forces, but also through the humble gifts of music and fertility that a wandering deity brings to village after village. Kokopelli's presence in the mythology and spiritual traditions of the Southwest peoples testifies to a vision of existence in which all dimensions of human experience, the spiritual and the erotic, the serious and the playful, the celestial and the terrestrial, are recognized and honored. He is perhaps the most fully human of the great spirits, and in his humanity, his humor, and his capacity to bring joy, he remains eternally young and eternally vital, forever traveling, forever playing his flute, forever bringing the gifts of fertility and abundance to those willing to receive them. We have journeyed now through the great spirits who embody creative principles: Spider-Woman with her weaving, Kokopelli with his music and fertility, the Thunderbird with its awesome power protecting humanity from chaos and destruction. Yet there exists another category of being in Native American mythology, one that is equally sacred but operates according to a different logic. While the spirits we have explored thus far are understood primarily as cosmic forces or divine beings existing outside ordinary human time, there emerges in the traditions of the Iroquois Confederacy a figure who is simultaneously legendary and historical, who existed within human memory and human society, yet whose actions and significance transcend the boundaries of ordinary human achievement. This is Hiawatha, whose name in the Ojibwa language means "he makes rivers," a man whose role in the formation of one of the most significant political and spiritual confederacies in Native American history is inseparable from his spiritual transformation and his participation in the divine vision of peace and unity. It is crucial to understand from the outset that the Hiawatha of whom we speak is not the fictional character created by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his famous 1855 poem. That literary creation, while inspired by Native American traditions and the concept of a transformative hero, drew primarily from Ojibwe mythology and the figure of Nanabodjo, the trickster teacher who appears in the traditions of the Great Lakes peoples. The real Hiawatha belongs to the traditions of the Iroquois Confederacy, specifically the Onondaga people, and his story is one of profound spiritual and political significance that is being preserved through oral tradition and passed down through centuries of Iroquois teaching and ceremony. According to the traditions that have been preserved, particularly through Mohawk and Onondaga oral histories, Hiawatha lived approximately in the middle of the 15th century, though some accounts place the events of his life earlier, suggesting dates in the 12th or 13th centuries. The exact timing remains somewhat uncertain, as indigenous oral traditions prioritize spiritual and moral significance over chronological precision in the manner of Western historical documentation. However, what is not uncertain is the profound impact that Hiawatha's life and choices had upon the political and spiritual development of the Iroquois peoples. The story of Hiawatha begins not with a figure of peace and unity, but with a man who was the opposite of these things. Before his great transformation, Hiawatha was known as a wild man and a cannibal. He lived in isolation, removed from the bonds of community and human kinship. His very sustenance came from practices that represented the ultimate transgression against human society. He consumed human flesh, violating the most fundamental boundary between civilization and savagery, between the ordered world of human community and the chaos of individual violence and degradation. The traditions describe Hiawatha's dwelling as a place of horror and transgression. He lived in a cabin removed from human settlement, and within that space he engaged in practices that were understood as the ultimate rejection of the principles through which human society is organized. According to the accounts preserved in oral tradition, Hiawatha had withdrawn from humanity not through accident or circumstance, but through choice. He had actively turned away from the bonds of kinship and community, embracing instead a path of isolation, violence, and self-destruction. It was at this darkest moment in Hiawatha's existence that there appeared to him a figure of tremendous spiritual significance. This being was known as Hiawatha, whose name means the Great Peacemaker. Hiawatha was understood as a prophet and spiritual leader, a being who came carrying a vision of profound importance, a vision of peace and unity among the Iroquois peoples who had for generations been locked in cycles of violence and warfare with one another. The encounter between Hiawatha and Hiawatha is recounted in a manner that emphasizes the spiritual dimension of transformation. According to the traditions, Hiawatha approached Hiawatha's cabin and, seeing the smoke rising from the fire within, climbed upon the roof. Looking down through the smoke hole that served as a chimney, he observed Hiawatha within, tending to a large kettle of water in which human flesh was being prepared for cooking. But Hiawatha was not deterred or horrified by what he witnessed. Rather, he understood that he had found the very person he needed for his mission of peace. When Hiawatha went to the water to draw from the kettle, something remarkable occurred. In the water's surface, Hiawatha saw a face reflected back at him, but it was not his own face. It was the face of Hiawatha, who had descended from the roof and positioned himself so that his reflection would appear to Hiawatha in the water. In that moment of recognition, something profound happened within Hiawatha's consciousness. Looking at this reflected face, Hiawatha perceived something that his own life had not contained, a beauty, a wisdom, and a strength that filled him with astonishment. More importantly, he perceived in this face a reflection of the person he might become, the person he had the potential to be if he could only turn away from the path he had chosen. And in that same moment he also perceived with crushing clarity the darkness and the degradation of the path he was currently walking. The contrast between the face he saw in the water and the face he knew his own reflection to show was the contrast between redemption and damnation, between the possibility of a different future and the dead end of his current existence. Hiawatha descended from the roof of the cabin and entered, sitting across the fire from Hiawatha. And there, in that intimate encounter between a prophet of peace and a man trapped in violence, Hiawatha began to share his vision. He spoke to Hiawatha of something called the Great Law of Peace, a spiritual and political principle that could unite the scattered Iroquois peoples and transform their cycles of violence into cycles of cooperation and mutual protection. The specific content of the Great Law of Peace is complex and comprehensive, and it would require extensive discussion to detail all its provisions and principles. But, in essence, the Great Law of Peace proposed a confederacy in which 5 separate nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, would come together, each maintaining their own internal governance but agreeing to coordinate their actions in matters of external policy and defense. Rather than each nation acting in isolation, pursuing their own interests and engaging in destructive conflicts with one another, they would unite as one people, drawing strength from their collective power while respecting the autonomy and dignity of each nation. The vision was both political and spiritual in nature. It represented not merely a practical agreement about military alliance and mutual defense, though it certainly included those elements. Rather, it represented a spiritual principle, the understanding that humanity is called to unite, to overcome the divisions and conflicts that separate peoples from one another, and to create structures through which peace and justice can be maintained. As Hiawatha shared this vision with Hiawatha, something profound occurred. Hiawatha accepted the message. More than that, he was transformed by it. In that moment, he made a choice that would define the rest of his existence. He agreed to become a follower of Hiawatha, to embrace the vision of peace and to dedicate himself to spreading this vision among his own people, the Onondaga, and eventually among all the Iroquois nations. Hiawatha gave Hiawatha a new name, one that reflected his new purpose and his new identity. He was no longer the wild man and cannibal. He was now Hiawatha, which means he who combs, a name that would prove to be deeply significant, for his first great task was to work with the Onondaga people and to bring them into the confederation that Dekanawida was proposing. However, the path forward was not straightforward. When Hiawatha returned to his own people and began to present the proposals and the vision of Dekanawida, he encountered fierce resistance. At the head of this resistance was the principal chief of the Onondaga, a man whose name was Tadadaho, or Atotaho, a figure of terrible power and cruelty. The traditions describe Tadadaho in terms that emphasize his spiritual and physical perversion. He is depicted as twisted both in body and in mind. His hair is described as being filled with living snakes. Snakes' eyes looked out from his finger ends. He possessed great magical power and used it not for the benefit of his people, but for his own aggrandizement and control. Tadadaho represented the principle of tyranny and division, of power used for domination rather than for the creation of harmony and unity. When Hiawatha presented Dekanawida's proposals to the councils of the Onondaga, Tadadaho consistently used his power to frustrate these efforts. He would disrupt the councils. He would use his magic to prevent the message of peace from taking hold. But more than this, in his anger and his determination to destroy Hiawatha's efforts, Tadadaho caused the death of Hiawatha's 3 daughters and his beloved wife. The traditions indicate that these deaths were accomplished through magic, through the mysterious workings of Tadadaho's supernatural power. In that moment, Hiawatha experienced a grief so profound that it threatened to destroy him. The very man who had just experienced a spiritual transformation and who had committed himself to the path of peace found himself devastated by loss, crushed by sorrow, brought to the edge of despair. This is a crucial moment in the tradition, for it reveals something essential, that the path toward peace and unity is not paved with easy victories or simple triumphs. Rather, those who commit themselves to such a path must often endure tremendous suffering and loss. Grief-stricken and unable to bear his sorrow any longer, Hiawatha left his village and wandered through the wilderness. And as he wandered, something remarkable occurred. He began to gather shells, whelk shells, and other shells, and he began the practice of stringing them together. These strings of shells became known as wampum, and they would take on profound spiritual significance in the traditions of the Iroquois Confederacy. According to the teachings, Hiawatha understood that wampum possessed the power to heal grief. He began seeking someone who understood the 13-string ceremony of condolence, a sacred ritual through which wampum could be used to ease grief and to restore a person to wholeness and balance. His search led him eventually to the territory of the Mohawk Nation, whom Dekanawida had already converted to the vision of peace. When Hiawatha arrived among the Mohawk, he found them gathered and united in their commitment to the great law of peace, and it was there that Dekanawida performed for him the condolence ceremony. The traditions preserve the words that Dekanawida chanted, words that have since become part of the Iroquois requickening ceremony and that continue to be used in times of grief and mourning. I wipe away the tears from thy face, using the white fawn skin of pity. I make it daylight for thee. I beautify the sky. Now shalt thou do thy thinking in peace. Through this ceremony, Hiawatha's grief was lifted. His tears were wiped away. His mind was restored to clarity. He was brought back from the edge of despair to a renewed commitment to the vision of peace that Dekanawida carried. And in that moment of spiritual restoration, Hiawatha and Dekanawida, working together with the Mohawk leaders, began to compose the laws of the Great Peace, the detailed provisions and principles through which the 5 nations would be united. With the Mohawk now united and aligned with the vision of peace, Hiawatha and Dekanawida began to travel to each of the other nations. They went first to the Oneida, who readily accepted the message of peace and unity. The Cayuga also received the vision with openness and willingness, but when they came to the Seneca Nation, they found a people divided against themselves, lacking unified leadership and unclear in their commitment to the Confederation. It was only when a great solar eclipse occurred, an event that was understood as a sign from the spiritual realm, a validation of the peace proposal from the cosmos itself, that the Seneca came to accept the vision and joined the Confederacy. The most significant challenge remained with the Onondaga and with Tadadaho himself. Tadadaho and his followers were initially opposed to the Confederation, but Dekanawida and Hiawatha, working together with the leaders of the 4 nations that had already accepted the vision, brought pressure to bear. The possibility of being opposed by 4 united nations was a tremendous force, and eventually Tadadaho came to understand that resistance was futile. But more than this, a remarkable spiritual transformation occurred. According to the traditions, an offer was made to Tadadaho. Rather than being destroyed or eliminated, he was offered the position of principal chief of the unified Confederacy. In this way, his power and his authority could be integrated into the new structure rather than standing in opposition to it. The pride and the ego that had driven Tadadaho's tyranny were honoured and recognised, but they were now channeled towards service to the greater Confederation. The traditions describe what occurred in remarkable spiritual language. In the end, the mind of Tadadaho was made straight, the crooks were taken out of his body, and Hiawatha combed the snakes out of his hair. Through the power of the vision of peace, through the commitment of the people, and through the willingness to offer Tadadaho a place of honour and authority, the very embodiment of tyranny and division was transformed into a participant in the structure of peace and unity. This transformation of Tadadaho represents something deeply significant in the teachings of the Iroquois Confederacy. It suggests that no person is beyond redemption, that even those who have embodied evil and cruelty can be transformed through the power of a greater vision. It suggests that the path to peace does not require the destruction of one's enemies, but rather their transformation and their incorporation into a larger whole. The Hiawatha Belt, a wampum belt of tremendous significance, was created to commemorate this confederation and to preserve its principles through a symbolic object. The belt depicts each of the 5 nations in the order of their position within the confederation. The Seneca appear farthest to the left, representing their role as keepers of the western door. Next is the Cayuga. In the centre of the belt, depicted with a distinctive symbol different from the others, is the Onondaga, who served as keepers of the central fire, the place where disputes were mediated and where the council fire of the Confederacy burned. Next is the Oneida, and finally, farthest to the right, is the Mohawk, the keepers of the eastern door. The white line that connects all the symbols together represents the unity of the Iroquois, the tree of peace that had taken root and grown to maturity through the efforts of Dekanawida and Hiawatha. This white line is sometimes described as the path of peace, the connection that binds all nations together and through which the principles of the great law of peace flow. Hiawatha's role in creating and spreading the vision of the great law of peace did not end with the formation of the Confederacy. Throughout his life, he served as one of the primary voices through which the vision was articulated and preserved. He was renowned for his speaking skills and his oratorical abilities. Where Dekanawida was said to suffer from a severe speech impediment that made it difficult for him to communicate directly, Hiawatha possessed the capacity to speak eloquently and persuasively. He could articulate the vision in ways that could be understood and accepted by different peoples with different interests and concerns. Hiawatha's legacy extends far beyond his lifetime. He became a model for leadership based not on domination and coercion, but on wisdom, eloquence, and commitment to a vision of unity and peace. The very title, Hiawatha, became associated with wise leadership and the capacity to bring diverse peoples together. In the contemporary period, Hiawatha remains a significant figure in Iroquois and Native American consciousness. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as the Iroquois Confederacy is known in the Iroquois language, continues to exist to this day and continues to be organized according to principles that derive from the Great Law of Peace that Hiawatha and Dekanawada helped establish. The Hiawatha belt remains a sacred object, a symbol of the unity that was achieved and the vision of peace that continues to guide the Iroquois peoples. What makes Hiawatha's story particularly significant in the context of Native American mythology is that it demonstrates the possibility of transformation and redemption. Unlike some of the other figures we have explored, who are cosmic forces or divine beings, Hiawatha is presented as fully human. He experiences grief. He commits acts of violence and degradation. He transforms through encounter with a spiritual vision and through commitment to a path of peace. And through his choices and his dedication, he changes not merely himself, but the entire destiny of his people and of many peoples. Hiawatha represents the principle that individual human choice, rooted in a vision of unity and peace, can have consequences that reverberate through generations. His decision to accept Dekanawada's vision, his willingness to endure suffering and loss in service to that vision, and his eloquent articulation of its principles resulted in the creation of a political and spiritual structure that has endured for over 500 years. Moreover, Hiawatha's story reveals something essential about leadership and power in indigenous understanding. True power does not come from domination or from the capacity to destroy one's enemies. Rather, it comes from wisdom, from eloquence, from commitment to principles that transcend individual interest, and from the capacity to bring diverse peoples into harmony with one another. The Thunderbird wields power through force and protection. But Hiawatha wields power through persuasion, through the articulation of a vision so compelling that people willingly embrace it, and through the demonstration that unity and peace are not only possible, but preferable to conflict and division. We have now explored a remarkable array of figures in Native American mythology and tradition. Spiritual beings like White Buffalo Calf Woman, Coyote, Spider Woman, and the Thunderbird, who operate according to cosmic principles and divine logic. And we have now encountered Hiawatha, a figure who is simultaneously human and archetypal, historical and legendary, serving as a model of human transformation and human capacity to align oneself with spiritual principles and to serve a vision greater than oneself. Together, these figures represent a comprehensive vision of human possibility and human potential, a vision in which individual human beings can participate in the divine work of creation, transformation, and the establishment of peace and unity in the world. We have journeyed through the spirits of transformation and power, the Thunderbird commanding the skies, Kokopelli bringing music and fertility through his wandering, and Hiawatha demonstrating how individual human commitment to vision can unite nations and establish peace. Now we must turn our attention to one of the most sacred and enduring figures in Native American spirituality, a being whose presence is felt not in distant cosmic realms or through human political achievement, but in the most intimate and essential dimension of human survival. In the food that sustains us, in the daily rituals of nourishment and gratitude, in the relationship between humanity and the earth that gives us life. This is the Corn Mother, known by different names across the diverse nations of North America. Among the Cherokee people, she is called Selu. Among the Abenaki and Penobscot peoples of the Northeast, she appears in the traditions as First Mother or Corn Woman. Among the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, she is recognized as fundamental to understanding the sacred nature of the earth itself. She appears across the agricultural societies of the eastern woodlands, the Great Plains and the Southwest, wherever corn was cultivated and revered, wherever this plant became central to human survival and spiritual practice. Her presence extends even further to peoples who cultivated other sacred plants and whose stories parallel hers, revealing something universal and eternal about the principle she embodies. The Corn Mother is not, in most traditions, depicted as a being of tremendous power in the manner of the Thunderbird. She does not wield destructive forces or command the elements. Rather, her power is the power of sustenance, of nourishment, of the quiet and patient transformation through which the earth feeds those who dwell upon it. Her strength lies not in dominance but in sacrifice, not in control but in generosity, not in taking but in giving. And yet, paradoxically, this quiet, patient power proves to be more essential and more enduring than the awesome might of the storm spirits or the cunning of the trickster. The fundamental myth of the Corn Mother exists in two primary versions, though each has countless variations depending on the specific tribal tradition through which it is told. These two versions reveal something essential about how different peoples have understood and integrated the same spiritual principle into their own cultural context. In the first version, which scholars sometimes call the immolation version, the Corn Mother appears as an older woman, often depicted as one who comes to a tribe in a moment of desperate need. The people are starving. The hunt has failed. The stores of food have been exhausted. Death seems imminent. It is in this moment of ultimate crisis that the Corn Mother arrives. Sometimes she simply appears in their encampment. Sometimes she is adopted by a family, particularly by a man who takes her as his wife, or by parents who take her as an adopted child. Regardless of how she arrives, her effect is immediate and miraculous. Food becomes abundant. Wherever the Corn Mother dwells, the people find themselves with enough to eat. Their hunger is satisfied. Their children no longer cry from the pangs of empty bellies. But this abundance carries within it a mystery. The people, naturally curious and perhaps troubled by the contradiction between this woman's humble appearance and the miraculous supply of food she somehow provides, eventually decide to spy upon her. They hide and watch as the Corn Mother goes about her daily activities, and then they discover the secret that explains everything. As the woman rubs her body, her arms, her legs, her torso, grains of corn fall from her flesh. In some versions of the story, it is described as though she was scraping off corns or boils from her skin. In other versions, the description is even more explicit and more disturbing. The food emerges from her body in ways that the observers find repugnant and incomprehensible. The woman is not simply providing food through some dignified spiritual means. Rather, she is transforming her own body into food. She is literally feeding her flesh to the people, converting the substance of her own being into the nourishment that sustains them. The reaction of the people to this discovery is crucial to understanding the meaning of the myth. Rather than being grateful or continuing to receive the Corn Mother's gift with appreciation, the observers are often filled with revulsion and fear. They accuse the woman of witchcraft. They believe she has deceived them. They view her means of producing the food as unnatural, obscene, disgusting, and in their disgust they turn against her. In some versions, they drive her away from the encampment, abandoning her and breaking her heart. In other versions, the story becomes even more dark and tragic. The people, convinced that she is a witch or a demon, decide to kill her. They murder the Corn Mother, this being who had sacrificed herself to feed them and had asked for nothing in return except that her gift be received and used according to her instructions. But the Corn Mother, even in her death, continues to feed the people. Before being killed, or sometimes with her consent and blessing, according to various versions, she gives precise and careful instructions about what must be done with her body. The people must take her corpse and drag it across the earth. They must draw her body through the soil. Wherever her flesh touches the ground, corn will grow. They must bury her bones at a central location, and from that place tobacco will grow, a plant which in many Native American traditions is understood as sacred medicine and a means of communication with the spiritual realm. The Penobscot people preserve a particularly detailed version of this story. In their tradition, after First Mother has been killed and her body has been dragged across the land by her grieving family, they wait in sorrow and fear. Then, after 7 moons have passed, they return to the places where First Mother's body had been dragged, and they find the earth covered with tall, green, tasseled plants. Corn has grown, not just a little, but in abundance, covering the land. The fruit of these plants, the ears of corn itself, is understood to be First Mother's flesh, transformed and renewed, given so that the people might live and flourish. The accounts describe how, when the people discovered this miraculous transformation, they wept. They wept for the loss of First Mother, for the terrible mistake they had made in not recognizing and honoring her gift. But they also wept with gratitude for the abundance that now surrounded them. And in that dual emotion, grief and gratitude combined, we find the essential response that all peoples who cultivate corn are called to maintain. Every harvest is a renewal of First Mother's sacrifice. Every consumption of corn is a participation in her flesh and her love. Every meal that sustains the people is a memorial to her selflessness. The Cherokee people preserve the Corn Mother myth under the name of their sacred being, Selu. In the Cherokee version, Selu existed as the first woman born from the first corn plant. She was the original mother, the first of all women, and she carried within her the power to sustain all life. According to the Cherokee teachings, Selu married a man, and together they had twin sons. Selu would disappear into a separate chamber in their dwelling, and when she emerged, she would bring forth corn and other foods. For a time, the family lived in abundance and peace. But eventually, the twin sons became suspicious and curious about where their mother was going and what she was doing. One day, they decided to follow Selu into her chamber. What they witnessed horrified and confused them. They saw their mother producing corn not through any ordinary means, but through a mysterious transformation of her own body. The young men, their minds filled with fear and misconception, their hearts not yet developed enough to understand sacrifice and divine mystery, concluded that their mother must be engaged in witchcraft. They thought she was a witch, a supernatural being whose practices were unnatural and dangerous, and in their fear and misunderstanding, they killed her. But Selu, even as she died, instructed her sons about what they must do. She told them to take her body and drag it through the soil, just as the Penobscot story describes. She promised them that wherever her body was dragged, corn would grow. She reminded them that this was not death but transformation, not an ending but a continuation. She was not abandoning them but rather committing herself eternally to their sustenance. The corn that would grow from her body would not be a temporary gift, but an eternal renewal. Year after year, season after season, as long as the Cherokee people honored her memory and maintained the practice of cultivation, Selu would return. She would live again in the corn that emerged from the earth. She would feed her children's children for generations, yet unborn. The second major version of the Corn Mother myth is sometimes called the flight version, and it depicts the Corn Mother in a somewhat different form. In this variation, rather than appearing as an old woman who comes to a desperate and starving people, the Corn Mother appears as a young, beautiful woman. She is often depicted as marrying into a tribe, as becoming the wife of a man whose people are suffering from hunger. This woman, through her mysterious power, provides abundance. But unlike the immolation version, in which the woman often comes willingly and knowingly sacrifices herself, in the flight version, the Corn Mother's secret is discovered through violation and disrespect. When her in-laws discover the truth about how she produces food, they are insulted. Rather than being grateful, they are offended by the means through which the abundance is created. They treat her with scorn and disrespect. Some versions describe explicit mockery. Her in-laws laugh at her, mock her appearance, use the most insulting language and gestures they can muster. In the face of this cruelty and ingratitude, the Corn Mother has a different reaction than her older counterpart in the immolation version. Rather than accepting her fate, rather than consenting to her own death, the young Corn Mother chooses to flee. She departs from the tribe, returning to her divine home, to the spiritual realm from which she came. In this version, it is often the Corn Mother's husband who pursues her, begging her to return. He alone among the tribe has recognized what she truly is and what she has given. He alone understands that her gift was sacred and that the tribe's treatment of her was a grave transgression. Some versions describe the husband pursuing the Corn Mother across vast distances through different landscapes until he finds her in a place between worlds, hidden under a duck's wing at the bottom of the ocean, or dwelling in a realm that exists at the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds. When he finds her, the Corn Mother does not simply return. Rather, she gives her husband seeds, sacred seeds of corn, and detailed instructions about how to cultivate them. She teaches him the practices and ceremonies that must accompany the planting of corn, the prayers that must be spoken, the gratitude that must be maintained. She tells him to bring these teachings back to his people, to teach them not merely to plant corn, but to do so with the understanding that they are participating in an ongoing relationship with a sacred being who continues to give her gift, though she now does so at a distance, through the mediation of seeds and ceremony, rather than through her direct presence. In both versions, whether the immolation version or the flight version, certain core teachings remain consistent. The Corn Mother's gift is never a one-time provision or a casual act of charity. Her gift is an eternal commitment, a sacrifice renewed with every growing season, an endless renewal of the sacred exchange between the divine and the human. But this gift comes with a condition. It requires gratitude, honor, and proper respect. The people must remember the Corn Mother. They must acknowledge her sacrifice. They must maintain the ceremonies and practices through which the relationship is perpetuated. If these conditions are violated, if the people forget Corn Mother, if they treat her gift with disrespect or take it for granted, then the gift may be withdrawn. This theme of reciprocal obligation, the understanding that sacred gifts come with responsibilities and that failure to maintain proper gratitude results in the withdrawal of the gift, appears again and again across Native American traditions. It reflects a sophisticated understanding of how the sacred operates in human experience. It is not a system in which divine beings exercise arbitrary power over passive humans. Rather, it is a relational system in which both the divine and the human have obligations toward one another. The Corn Mother is particularly important in the spiritual traditions of agricultural peoples, but her significance extends even to non-agricultural societies who learned about corn through contact with peoples who cultivated it. Among the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, the Corn Mother is so fundamental to spiritual understanding that she is virtually synonymous with Mother Earth herself. She represents the principle through which the earth gives life, through which the soil transforms seeds into plants that nourish humanity. In the understanding of Pueblo spirituality, every ear of corn that grows is an embodiment of the Corn Mother's presence and power. The Arikara people preserve traditions about a Corn Mother whom they understood as having been created by their creator deity Neshanu from an ear of corn. This Corn Mother became the protector of the Arikara people, leading them to their homeland and teaching them the practices through which they could sustain themselves through agriculture. In this tradition, the Corn Mother is understood not only as a divine being who provides food, but as a guide and protector who helps the people find their place in the world. One of the most important teachings associated with the Corn Mother is the recognition that she is not alone. Among many agricultural peoples, corn is understood as one of the three sisters, a sacred trio that includes corn, beans, and squash. These three plants are understood not merely as practical crops that complement one another in providing necessary nutrition, though they certainly do that. Rather, they are understood as three manifestations of feminine sacred power, three aspects of the generative and life-giving principle that sustains human existence. The agricultural practices that honor the three sisters reflect a sophisticated understanding of ecological balance and symbiotic relationship. The corn grows tall and provides a natural structure for the beans to climb. The beans, in turn, capture nitrogen from the air and deposit it in the soil, enriching the very earth in which the corn grows. The squash, with its broad leaves, shades the ground and retains moisture, protecting both corn and beans from excessive heat and dryness. Together, the three plants support one another, each providing something that the others need. This arrangement demonstrates a principle that appears throughout Native American philosophy: the idea that diverse elements can exist in harmony, each contributing to the whole, each receiving nourishment from the others. In the context of the three sisters, the Corn Mother takes on particular significance as the representative of the masculine principle of growth and elevation. The corn reaches upward toward the sky, seeking the light. The beans represent the connective principle, bringing earth and sky into relationship. The squash represents the feminine principle of abundance and protection, spreading across the earth, sheltering what grows beneath her leaves. Together, they create a balance of masculine and feminine, of sky and earth, of growth and nourishment. The sacred practices associated with the Corn Mother vary among different peoples, but share certain common elements. Many peoples hold ceremonies at specific times in the agricultural year. At planting time, when seeds are placed in the earth and prayers are offered, requesting the Corn Mother's presence and blessing. At the time of first emergence, when the young corn plants break through the soil and their growth is celebrated. And at harvest time, when gratitude is expressed for the abundance that has been provided. Among the Cherokee and other eastern woodland peoples, the green corn ceremony, also known as the busk, is one of the most significant annual ceremonial occasions. This ceremony, held at the time of the early corn harvest, serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It is a Thanksgiving celebration for the harvest. It is a time of renewal and cleansing, when old grievances are forgiven and the community is restored to harmony. It is a time when young people are initiated into adulthood and when important leadership decisions are made. And it is fundamentally a time of honoring the Corn Mother and renewing the relationship between the people and this sacred being. What makes the Corn Mother particularly significant in the context of the broader Native American spiritual vision we have been exploring is that she represents a different kind of power than most of the other great spirits. The Thunderbird wields power through force and protection. Coyote wields power through cunning and transformation. Spider-Woman embodies power through patient creativity and the weaving together of threads. But the Corn Mother represents the power of sacrifice and sustenance, the understanding that true strength lies not in domination but in giving, that the greatest power is the power to nurture and to continue giving even when one's gift is taken for granted or misunderstood. Moreover, the Corn Mother is unique among the great spirits in the degree to which her presence and power are tied directly to human practice and human responsibility. White Buffalo Calf Woman brought ceremonies and teachings to humanity, but the ceremonies themselves are what humans must perform. Kokopelli brings fertility and music, but humans must be willing to receive his gifts and to learn from them. But the Corn Mother's existence and continued presence depend absolutely on human participation. The corn must be planted and cultivated according to proper practices. The ceremony and gratitude must be maintained. If humans fail to do their part, if they neglect the Corn Mother or treat her with disrespect, then the gift ceases. This interdependence between the Corn Mother and humanity reflects a sophisticated understanding of reciprocal responsibility. It teaches that the sacred is not something distant and abstract, but something intimately tied to daily human action and human choice. Every person who plants corn participates in an ancient relationship. Every person who harvests corn participates in a sacred exchange. Every person who eats corn is literally consuming the body of the Corn Mother, and thus entering into a profound covenant of gratitude and responsibility. In contemporary times, as industrial agriculture and monoculture farming have become dominant, many indigenous peoples have experienced a disconnection from the traditional understanding and practice of honouring the Corn Mother. However, there has also been a movement toward what is called food sovereignty, the determination of indigenous peoples to maintain traditional agricultural practices, to preserve traditional crop varieties, and to reassert the spiritual and cultural significance of cultivation. Among many Native American communities today, there exists a conscious effort to return to the Three Sisters agriculture, to grow traditional corn varieties that carry the genetic memory of centuries of indigenous cultivation, and to maintain the ceremonies and practices through which the relationship with the Corn Mother is perpetuated. This is not merely a matter of practical agriculture or food security, though it certainly serves those purposes. Rather, it is a matter of spiritual restoration and cultural continuity. By planting and cultivating corn in the traditional ways, by performing the traditional ceremonies, by maintaining gratitude and respect, contemporary indigenous peoples are continuing a conversation with the Corn Mother that has been maintained for thousands of years. The story of the Corn Mother also carries particular resonance in the context of the history of indigenous peoples in North America. The colonization and displacement of Native American peoples has often been accompanied by the disruption of traditional agricultural practices and the imposition of industrial farming methods. The very crops that had been cultivated for millennia according to sacred principles, corn, beans, and squash, became subject to commodity agriculture, monoculture, and genetic modification. The relationship between people and plants, which had been understood as sacred and reciprocal, became transformed into a purely economic relationship. In this context, the Corn Mother myth takes on additional layers of meaning. The experience of Native American peoples who have been displaced from their lands, whose resources have been extracted, whose spiritual practices have been attacked and suppressed, resonates in many ways with the story of the Corn Mother being rejected and killed by those she feeds. The irony is profound. Peoples who were sustained by the Corn Mother's gift for thousands of years came under the dominion of a colonial system that disrupted that relationship and attempted to replace it with systems based on extraction and domination rather than reciprocity and gratitude. Yet even in the context of this disruption and attempted destruction, the Corn Mother's teaching remains vital. The fact that so many Native American communities today are consciously working to restore traditional agriculture, to recover heirloom seeds, and to re-establish the spiritual practices associated with corn cultivation suggests that the relationship with the Corn Mother is not so easily severed. Despite centuries of disruption, the ancient reciprocal covenant remains alive and continues to call people back to gratitude, respect, and the maintenance of sacred practices. When we consider the Corn Mother in the context of the other great spirits and figures we have explored, the cosmic powers like White Buffalo Calf Woman and the Thunderbird, the cultural transformers like Coyote and Hiawatha, the creative forces like Spider-Woman and Kokopelli. We perceive a comprehensive vision of human place within the cosmos. These figures and forces represent different dimensions of the sacred and different modalities through which the divine manifests in human experience. But the Corn Mother occupies a unique position in this vision precisely because her domain is the most intimate and most essential. She is present at every meal. She sustains every body. She connects every person to the earth and to the cycle of seasons. She teaches through her sacrifice and through her gift the fundamental principles upon which all existence depends, that life feeds on life, that gifts require gratitude, that power manifests most fully through generosity rather than through dominance. As long as there are people who plant corn, who harvest it, who eat it, and who remember the one who gave her body so that they might live, the Corn Mother remains present. She lives in every kernel, in every plant that pushes up through the soil, in every ear that ripens under the summer sun. She is the eternal mother, the infinite giver, the sacred being whose sacrifice ensures the continuation of life itself. We have now journeyed through the great spirits who embody creation, transformation, protection, and nourishment. The cosmic forces that operate according to principles we can understand, beings whose power manifests in ways that are, at their core, comprehensible to human consciousness. But there exists another category of beings in Native American mythology, one that belongs to a different order of existence entirely. These are not the great divinities or the cosmic principles. Rather, these are the troublesome spirits of the forest, the ambiguous beings who exist at the boundary between the helpful and the harmful, between magic and mischief, between the visible and invisible worlds. These are the Pukwudgies creatures, whose name translates from the Algonquian languages as little persons of the wilds, or, in some interpretations, the little wild man of the woods that vanishes. The Pukwudgies appear in the folklore and spiritual traditions of the Wampanoag people, the Lenape or Delaware peoples, the Chippewa or Ojibwe nations, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples of what is now New England, the Great Lakes region, and extending into territories that reach from Massachusetts and Rhode Island through New York, Pennsylvania, and into what is now Indiana and Ohio. Unlike many of the other beings we have explored, the Pukwudgies are not understood primarily as cosmic forces or as figures who brought sacred teachings to humanity. Rather, they belong to a category of folklore that might be compared to the fairies or the fae folk of European tradition, magical beings who exist in the liminal spaces of the world, in the forests and the wild places beyond the reach of human settlement, operating according to their own logic and their own desires. They are neither entirely benevolent nor entirely malevolent, though their behavior has shifted dramatically over the course of their interaction with humanity. And their story reveals something essential about the consequences of ingratitude, disrespect, and the violation of sacred reciprocity. According to the traditions preserved by the Wampanoag and related peoples, the Pukwudgies were not always enemies of humanity. Rather, in the distant past, they were understood as helpful beings who attempted to assist the people. They would leave food in places where humans would find it. They would offer guidance and protection in the wilderness. They contributed their magic and their knowledge to support human survival and flourishing. In essence, they performed a function not entirely different from the one performed by Kokopelli or by the Corn Mother. They were givers of gifts, providers of nourishment and aid. But the humans, according to the traditions, did not understand or appreciate this help. The people were ungrateful. They took the gifts that the Pukwudgies provided without acknowledging their source or offering thanks. More troublingly, the people directed their affection and their gratitude toward other beings, specifically toward a great culture hero and creator figure known as Morshop, whose wife was called Granny Squannet. Maushop was understood as a tremendous being, a giant whose power and generosity toward humanity were legendary. It was to Maushop that the people turned when they encountered difficulties. It was Maushop whom they honored and revered. It was Maushop who received the gratitude and the love that the Pukwudgies felt they deserved. This situation, in which one's gifts are given without recognition, in which one's efforts at help are met with indifference or ingratitude, in which one sees others receive the honor and affection one believes oneself to have earned, is a profoundly painful experience, particularly for beings who had approached humanity with genuine desire to help. The Pukwudgies, in their hurt and their anger, began to change. They withdrew their helpful behaviors. They ceased to leave gifts. They stopped offering protection and guidance. And then, more significantly, they began to engage in what can only be described as malicious mischief and outright hostility. The Pukwudgies started to steal food that humans had gathered. They would throw sand into the eyes of travelers, temporarily blinding them and causing them to lose their way in the wilderness. They would set small fires that threatened to spread and consume villages. They would play pranks that ranged from merely annoying to genuinely dangerous. They appeared and disappeared at will, using their magical powers to evade capture and to strike when least expected. The humans found themselves plagued by these troublesome creatures, and they did not know what to do. Desperate for assistance, the people approached Granny Squannet, the wife of Maushop, and complained to her about the troubles they were experiencing. They described how the Pukwudgies were tormenting them, how their lives were being made miserable by these magical creatures. Granny Squannet listened to their complaints and brought them before her husband, Maushop the Great One, and told him what was happening. Maushop, understanding both the situation and the threat that the Pukwudgies represented, made a decision. Rather than attempting to negotiate with the troublesome creatures or to convince them to cease their mischief, Maushop chose a more direct approach. He asked the humans to gather together as many Pukwudgies as they could capture and bring them to him. The humans, desperate to end the torment, obliged. They hunted through the forests and the wild places, and they managed to capture a significant number of the small magical beings. When the captured Pukwudgies had been brought before Maushop, he performed an action that would have consequences echoing across centuries. He took the creatures and, with tremendous force, threw them across vast distances. He scattered them across what is now the northeastern part of North America, and into the Great Lakes region. Some were cast to the south and west, so far that they ended up in territories as distant as what is now Indiana and Ohio. The Pukwudgies, who had previously been concentrated in particular regions, primarily around what is now Massachusetts and the territories of the Wampanoag and related peoples, were now dispersed across a much larger geographic area. This dispersal, this violent scattering, did not resolve the conflict between the Pukwudgies and humanity. Rather, it exacerbated it. In being so brutally displaced, in being torn from their home territories and cast into unfamiliar lands, the Pukwudgies did not become pacified or reconciled. Instead, their sense of grievance intensified. They had originally felt that their helpful actions had been unappreciated. Now they had experienced direct violence at the hands of humans and their allies. Now they had been torn from the only lands they knew and cast as exiles across the continent. The hurt and the anger that they felt reached a new level of intensity. And so, according to some variations of the tradition, the Pukwudgies returned. They came back with a determination not merely to cause mischief, but to take revenge. They began to kill humans. They kidnapped people and carried them off to unknown places. They lured travelers deep into the forests, causing them to become hopelessly lost, then abandoned them to suffer or perish. They used their magic to set fires that consumed villages. They employed their supernatural abilities to strike at the very heart of the communities that had captured and scattered them. Malshop, perceiving the escalating violence and recognizing the genuine threat that the returning Pukwudgies represented, took action again. He sent his own sons, 5 warriors of tremendous power and skill, to seek out the Pukwudgies and to eliminate them, to end their threat to humanity once and for all. But the Pukwudgies, in their desperation and their desire for vengeance, proved to be formidable opponents. When Malshop's sons tracked them into the deep forests and pursued them through wild terrain, the Pukwudgies used their magical abilities and their knowledge of the land to outmaneuver their pursuers. In one particularly significant battle, the Pukwudgies lured Malshop's sons into deep grass where they could not see clearly. And then, from this concealment, the Pukwudgies attacked with their magical weapons, poison arrows and spears that struck with deadly force. All 5 of Malshop's sons were killed in this confrontation. In some versions of the tradition, the story becomes even more dark. Some accounts suggest that the Pukwudgies, emboldened by their victory over Malshop's sons and continuing their quest for vengeance against the entire structure of beings who had opposed them, eventually managed to kill Malshop himself. In other versions, they killed Granny Squannet. The exact details vary depending on which tradition is being recounted, but the essential meaning remains constant. The Pukwudgies, who had begun as helpful beings and had been brutally scattered and displaced, became a genuine and significant threat to the survival and well-being of human communities. What is crucial to understand about this story is that it is not a simple narrative of good versus evil, of a pure evil force that must be eliminated, or a purely virtuous force that acts without consequence. Rather, it is a complex account of escalating misunderstanding, ingratitude leading to hurt feelings leading to mischief, mischief leading to violent response leading to intensified vengeance. It is a story about how the violation of reciprocity, the failure to recognize and acknowledge help when it is given, can result in the transformation of a potentially beneficial relationship into a deeply destructive and dangerous one. The physical appearance of the Pukwudgies, as described in the oral traditions, is distinctive and easily recognizable. They are understood to be quite small creatures, typically standing no more than 2 to 3 feet in height, roughly knee-high to an average adult human. They possess large ears and large noses that protrude prominently from their faces. Their skin is described as smooth and grey, resembling stone or slate in texture and colour. Their eyes, according to accounts, are sharp and intelligent, reflecting a consciousness and an awareness that transcends what one might expect from a creature of their size. Most distinctive of all is the covering of porcupine-like quills that runs from the top of their heads down the entire length of their backs and their spines. These quills are not merely decorative, they possess a magical quality and can be used as weapons. The quills are one of the most recognizable features of the Pukwudgies, and they are so prominent that observers who encounter a Pukwudgie from behind might momentarily mistake it for an actual porcupine standing upright on its hind legs until the creature turns around, revealing the distinctly humanoid face and the characteristic malevolent or mischievous expression that marks it as something far more dangerous and purposeful than a mere animal. The Pukwudgies possess several supernatural abilities that make them particularly formidable and difficult to deal with. They have the power to become invisible at will, vanishing from sight and rendering themselves undetectable even to those who might be specifically searching for them. They can appear and disappear with remarkable speed, materializing in one location and vanishing from another with no apparent transition or travel between the 2 points. They are capable of shape-shifting, transforming themselves into animals or other forms, in order to deceive humans or to move through territories without being recognized. Most significantly, the Pukwudgies possess genuine magical power. They can create fire through supernatural means, allowing them to set fires that burn with unusual intensity and that prove difficult or impossible to extinguish through ordinary means. They use magic arrows and poison-tipped weapons that strike with deadly force. Some accounts suggest that they have the power to control or influence the elements, to cause storms, or to direct wind and rain. They can lure people deeper and deeper into forests until the humans become hopelessly disoriented and lost, unable to find their way back to civilization despite their best efforts to retrace their steps. In some traditions, the Pukwudgies are understood to have the power to control what are called Tai Pai Wankus, understood to be the souls or the spiritual essence of Native Americans who have been killed. These entities are held captive by the Pukwudgies, bound to serve them and to carry out their malicious purposes. This aspect of Pukwudgie mythology reveals something quite dark: the understanding that these creatures possess not merely physical or magical power, but spiritual power as well. They can capture and control not just the bodies, but the souls of their victims, condemning them to an eternity of servitude in a form of supernatural bondage. The geography of Pukwudgie habitation is particularly significant. The creatures are said to originate from and to be most powerfully present in what is now known as Hockomock Swamp in Massachusetts. This swamp, spanning thousands of acres across multiple towns and bordered by the town of Bridgewater, has long held a reputation as a place of supernatural significance. It is understood as a realm where the boundary between the ordinary world and the spiritual world is particularly thin, where the normal rules and restrictions that govern reality seem to be suspended or weakened. The Bridgewater Triangle, an area encompassing Hockomock Swamp and surrounding territories, has been the subject of numerous accounts of unusual phenomena. Strange lights in the sky, creatures that do not fit ordinary categories of animal or human, disappearances and vanishings that seem inexplicable. Whether these phenomena are genuinely the result of Pukwudgie activity, or whether the tales have taken on a life of their own through retelling and embellishment over centuries, is a question that remains unanswered. What is clear is that the region maintains a powerful hold on the imaginations of those who know its stories, and the Pukwudgies remain a significant part of the cultural and spiritual understanding of the lands they inhabit. From Hockomock Swamp and the territories of the Wampanoag, accounts of Pukwudgie sightings and encounters extend across a wide geographic area. They are reported in the forests of Rhode Island and Connecticut. They appear in the mountains and valleys of New York and Pennsylvania. They are encountered in the forests of the Great Lakes region and in the territories of what is now Indiana and Ohio. This wide distribution reflects both the historical dispersal that Maushop accomplished, scattering the creatures across the continent, and the subsequent ability of the Pukwudgies to adapt to diverse environments and to maintain their presence across a vast territory. In contemporary times, the Pukwudgies continue to be part of the cultural and spiritual tradition of the Algonquian-speaking peoples and of the regions where they are said to dwell. There are documented accounts, particularly in the 20th century, from individuals claiming to have encountered Pukwudgies in the wild. One notable account comes from Paul Startzman, an author and amateur archaeologist who wrote about his own encounters with the creatures. Startzman describes an encounter in 1927, when he was only 10 years old, in which he saw a small humanoid figure with distinctive features that matched the traditional descriptions of Pukwudgies. He describes the creature as being roughly half his size, with blonde hair covering its head like a helmet and prominent round ears. What is particularly significant about such modern accounts is that they suggest that belief in the reality of Pukwudgies is not merely a matter of historical tradition or folklore preserved through storytelling. Rather, there remain individuals who claim direct experiential knowledge of these creatures, who assert that they have encountered them in the physical world and who understand the Pukwudgies as genuinely real beings existing in the contemporary world just as they had existed in past times. The teachings and warnings about Pukwudgies that have been preserved through Algonquian oral tradition are remarkably consistent. The primary teaching is simple and direct. The Pukwudgies should be left alone. If one encounters a Pukwudgie in the forest or in the wild places, the wise course of action is not to engage with the creature, but to withdraw from its presence as quickly as possible and to do nothing that might anger or antagonize it. The reason for this teaching is equally clear. The Pukwudgies bear grudges against humans, and their anger, if provoked, can result in serious or fatal consequences. They retain memories of past mistreatment and continue to harbour resentment toward humanity for the violence and displacement they experienced at the hands of Maushop and the human communities he protected. They are not beings who can be reasoned with or appeased through ordinary means. They follow their own logic and their own desires, and these do not necessarily align with human interests or safety. However, it is important to understand that the danger posed by Pukwudgies is not absolute or inevitable. If one leaves them alone, if one refrains from annoying or antagonizing them, then the danger is considerably reduced. In the worst case, one might experience minor mischief, one's possessions might go missing, one might encounter inexplicable obstacles in one's path, one might have a confusing experience in the forest where directions seem to become unclear or reversed. But these lesser troubles are far preferable to the active hostility and the genuine danger that results from angering a Pukwudgie or attempting to capture or harm one. The Pukwudgie mythology reveals several important principles that appear again and again throughout Native American spiritual traditions. The first is the principle of reciprocity, the understanding that gifts and help given should be acknowledged and honored, and that the failure to do so has consequences. The Pukwudgies originally offered help to humans without asking for anything except recognition and gratitude. When that recognition was not forthcoming, the relationship was fundamentally altered. The Pukwudgies' shift from helpfulness to hostility is presented not as an arbitrary change of nature, but as a logical consequence of the violation of reciprocity. The second principle relates to the theme of displacement and vengeance. The Pukwudgies, once scattered across the continent by Maushop, did not simply disappear or accept exile passively. Rather, they retained their sense of grievance and their desire for revenge. They channeled their hurt and their anger into active opposition to those who had harmed them. This reflects a worldview in which the injustices done to beings, even small magical beings, have consequences and cannot simply be forgotten or overlooked. The third principle relates to the recognition of otherness, the understanding that there exist beings in the world who operate according to their own logic and their own desires, beings who are not simply to be controlled or exploited according to human wishes. The Pukwudgies are not demons to be destroyed or angels to be revered. They are simply other different from humans in their nature, their powers, and their understanding. The proper response to such otherness is respectful distance, not domination or forced integration into human communities. The Pukwudgies represent a category of being that appears in many indigenous traditions, the trickster-like spirit who is neither wholly good nor wholly evil, who can be dangerous but who also embodies important principles and teachings. Unlike many of the other great spirits we have explored, who carry clear messages or teachings about how humans should live, the Pukwudgies teach primarily through cautionary example. They teach respect for the magical dimensions of the world. They teach the importance of recognizing help when it is given and of expressing gratitude. They teach the consequences of ingratitude and disrespect. They teach the wisdom of maintaining respectful distance from forces and beings that one does not fully understand. In the context of the comprehensive Native American spiritual vision we have been exploring throughout this narration, the Pukwudgies occupy a particular and important position. Where White Buffalo Calf Woman brought order and ceremony, where the Thunderbird brings protection through power, where Kokopelli brings music and fertility, where the Corn Mother brings nourishment and sacrifice, and where Hiawatha demonstrates human capacity to achieve transformation and unity, the Pukwudgies represent the principle of consequence. They demonstrate that actions have effects, that violations of reciprocity produce results, that those who are harmed do not simply disappear but continue to exist and to act according to their own understanding. The story of the Pukwudgies is ultimately a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing all forms of life and all forms of help, even those that come from sources we might not fully understand or expect. It is a teaching that the natural world and the spiritual world are populated by many different kinds of beings, many different kinds of intelligences and powers, and that the wise course is not to attempt to control or exploit all of them according to human wishes, but rather to move through the world with respect, with gratitude, and with a recognition that there are forces and beings that deserve to be left alone, that should be honored from a distance, and that will respond to violation with an intensity that humans would be wise to avoid. We have journeyed far in these stories, dreamers. We have walked with the great spirits who shaped the cosmos and who continue to shape it still. We have encountered White Buffalo Calf Woman who brought order and ceremony to a people in spiritual crisis. We have witnessed the cunning transformations of Coyote, whose selfish impulses paradoxically serve the greater good. We have seen Spider-Woman weaving the very fabric of creation through patient, sacred work. We have felt the awesome power of the Thunderbird, protecting humanity through force and sacrifice. We have traveled with Kokopelli, carrying his music and fertility across landscapes, reminding us that joy and creativity are not luxuries, but spiritual necessities. We have stood alongside Hiawatha, witnessing how individual human choice rooted in vision can transform entire nations and establish peace. We have been nourished by the Corn Mother, who teaches us that the greatest power flows through sacrifice and generosity, and we have learned caution from the Pukwudgies, understanding that consequence follows violation and that respect for otherness is wisdom. What these stories reveal, taken together, is something profoundly important. Native American spirituality is not a system of abstract principles or distant deities indifferent to human concerns. Rather, it is a living, dynamic vision in which the sacred permeates every dimension of existence. Creation is not a single event relegated to distant mythological time, but an ongoing process in which humans participate. The divine operates not through distant command, but through intimate relationship, through reciprocal exchange, through the principle that gifts must be honored and that violation of sacred reciprocity produces real consequences. These beings and figures, whether cosmic spirits or human heroes, whether creators or transformers, whether protectors or teachers, all teach us something essential about what it means to exist within a sacred cosmos. They teach that power without service is tyranny. They teach that change is inevitable and necessary. They teach that creation requires patience and skill. They teach that protection sometimes demands force. They teach that joy and music sustain the spirit as surely as food sustains the body. They teach that unity can be achieved through vision and commitment. They teach that nourishment comes through sacrifice. They teach that consequences follow from our choices. They teach that respect for mystery and otherness is not weakness, but wisdom. In our contemporary moment, as we face ecological crises and spiritual disorientation, as we confront systems of exploitation and extraction that mirror the violence directed toward the Pukwudgies, or the violation of reciprocity that transformed helpful beings into antagonists, these ancient teachings remain urgently relevant. They speak to the necessity of moving through the world with gratitude. They remind us that we exist within webs of relationship and interdependence. They teach us that sustainability is not merely a practical concern but a spiritual one, that the earth and all beings deserve respect and honoring, not domination and extraction. The oral traditions that have preserved these stories for thousands of years continue to live and to speak to those willing to listen. Every time a story is told, the spirits and beings it describes are remembered and honored. Every time we engage with these teachings, we participate in an ancient conversation that stretches backward through time and forward into the future. We connect ourselves with countless generations who have heard these same stories and received their teachings. As you leave this space and return to your daily lives, carry these stories with you. Remember White Buffalo Calf Woman's commitment to sacred ceremony and teaching. Carry something of Coyote's willingness to challenge stagnant order. Emulate Spider-Woman's patient creativity. Honor the Thunderbird's principle that true power serves something greater than itself. Allow Kokopelli's music and joy to remind you that life is meant to be lived with delight and creativity. Follow Hiawatha's example in committing yourself to visions of unity and peace. Receive the Corn Mother's gift with gratitude and respect. And remember the Pukwudgies' lesson, that violation of reciprocity carries consequences, and that respect for otherness is not submission but wisdom. The spirits of Native American mythology do not belong only to indigenous peoples, though they originated in indigenous consciousness and carry the particular genius and wisdom of those cultures. Rather, they represent principles and forces that are universal. They speak to the human condition itself, to the eternal challenges and possibilities that all people face. In listening to these stories, we participate in a human wisdom that transcends cultural boundaries while honoring the specific peoples from whom these teachings emerged. Thank you for journeying with us through these realms of spirit and story. Thank you for taking the time to listen, to contemplate, and to allow these ancient teachings to speak to your consciousness. In a world that often moves too quickly, that demands constant distraction and consumption, the simple act of listening to stories is itself a form of resistance and renewal. It is a way of honoring the voices of those who came before us. It is a way of connecting ourselves to something larger and older and wiser than the immediate moment. May these stories continue to live in you. May the spirits and beings you have encountered in this narration guide your steps and inform your choices. May you walk through the world with the gratitude that the Corn Mother teaches. May you honor reciprocity and recognize violation when you see it. May you move forward with the courage of Hiawatha and the wisdom of Dekanawida. May you create and weave beauty like Spider-Woman. May you protect those who cannot protect themselves, like the Thunderbird. May you find joy and music in your journey, like Kokopelli. May you recognize transformation when it comes, like Coyote. May you receive sacred teachings when they are offered, like those who encountered White Buffalo Calf Woman. And may you maintain respectful distance from mysteries and forces you do not fully understand, remembering the lesson of the Pukwudgies. The spirits are always present, dreamers. They dwell in the wild places and the sacred spaces. They move through the seasons and the cycles of human life. They wait to be remembered, to be honored, to be called upon when we are ready to receive their wisdom. And as long as there are people willing to listen to their stories, to preserve their teachings, and to live according to their principles, these spirits will endure. They will continue to guide, to protect, to transform, and to illuminate the path forward. Thank you for being here, in this sacred space where stories live and spirits speak. Thank you for opening your hearts and your minds to these teachings. Until we meet again in another journey through the realms of Native American spirituality and wisdom, walk in balance, walk in gratitude, and walk in honor of all that has come before and all that will come after.